it's kind of funny, like, you can create like a really fantastic sound in a computer, right? Like, I love computer music. We could spend 2 hours on that, but you can't like slap the side of your laptop and make it do something new. So like there's something open, and people are getting very good at building physical, like, digital interfaces that have a high degree of flexibility. You can get metaphorical side slapping, but there is something very, I think it's the influence of those sounds on me, like on me as a listener and a composer, and then also just the immediacy and the freedom of having it be an object. Like the gravity harp, for example, like if I don't want to use those bouncing balls, I just throw them over the back and pluck the thing, or, hit it with a mallet. And so it's sort of that sort of freedom, because I think a lot of my performance practice and really creative practice in general is based around like tinkering. And so that's one way to it's like, it's hard to, especially when you want to get away from screens, when screens are so much of our lives. That I think is the main motivation, is that like a physical object has no like parameter. I mean, it does what it does, but it also can do whatever you do to it,
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. How's it going, y'all? Welcome to another edition of the podcast. If it's your first time here, my name is Tyler. I'm a composer, broadcaster, a producer. I wear a lot of different hats. I like to just make a lot of different things, and I love to sit down and talk with other creative people about how they make their work and what drives them to create. There are over 50 episodes now of this podcast, some really great deep dives into all kinds of different types of artists, composers, and whatnot. And so after you're finished with this episode, if you like what you heard, I encourage you to check out this deep archive of interviews that I now have. Over 50 episodes of Music Maker. Really cool. And of course, if you've been listening for a while, welcome back. It is so great to have you with me today. Today I'm joined by composer, performer, installation artist, and instrument builder Rob Funkhouser. Based in Indianapolis, Rob builds instruments out of materials that most people just kind of walk past without a second thought. Things like metal mixing bowls, glass rods, plywood, copper pipe, and then he writes music for those things. He's composer in residence and artistic director for Sound Ecologies, a resident artist with Big Car Collaborative, and his installation work has reached thousands of people through exhibitions at galleries, public spaces, and even Burning Man. In our conversation, we trace a path that begins with singing along to a vacuum cleaner as a toddler, and it winds through a failed timpani audition, a philosophy detour, depression, a chance encounter at a Starbucks in Richmond, Indiana, of all places, and 6 years running a percussion museum in the basement of a mall, before arriving at a practice where composing, building, performing, and community making are all expressions of the same restless curiosity. We talk about what draws a composer to build instruments rather than synthesize sounds electronically, for example, how translation between formats unlocks new musical ideas, why the blank page is the enemy, and a music box might be the cure, and what it means to make music that surprises people with simple things. I love Rob. He's one of my favorite people. I love this conversation. Can't wait to get into it, and it gets started in just a moment. Before we jump into things, a quick note. If you want to stay connected to what I'm building here, like new episodes, behind-the-scenes thoughts, and updates on projects like Living Classical, my new independently produced radio show, well, the best way to do that is through the newsletter. You can sign up on our website, that's looseleaftransmissions.com, or visit the link in the show notes. Now, on to my conversation with Rob Funkhouser. Well, Rob, I'm really excited to be sitting down with you, and I just want to start off by giving a shout out to our good friend Evan Miller, who not only introduced us to one another, but I'm about 99% sure that it was Evan who, when I first launched this podcast about 2 years ago, he implored me to have you on as a guest. So Evan, thank you. It's finally happening. You've been on my list ever since. So
Yeah.
I'm quite glad to be able to finally have you on, Rob, and appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real honor. Some of the work you've been doing is really great. The podcast is awesome. And it is funny. Evan is a great guy, and
Oh yeah.
we've had a lot of good times together and find ourselves ending up in random places, and he's special. And if you know, I'll plug his show, The Outside, on WYSO, which is one of the finest experimental radio shows. Happens every Sunday, I think from 12 to 2 or something.
Yeah, I love the work Evan's doing, and love that he brought us together. So
Yeah.
let's see where we go. So where we like to start here on Music Maker is as far back as you're willing to share, or as far back as you remember, and that is, what is your earliest artistic memory as a composer? And since so much of what we're going to talk about is also instrument building, I suppose like maybe your earliest memory is like a sound maker, maybe.
Sure. Yeah, I have a couple of just sort of almost like fragmented memories from when I was a toddler. I used to sing along to the vacuum.
Okay,
Like if
cool.
you
Yeah.
ever if you like, some people sing along to their electric toothbrush now.
Mm,
So it's like just kind of exploring that, and it wasn't like I knew what I was doing. I just have that memory. I used to do that. But one of my first memories of really deciding that I wanted to start making sounds was like very shortly after I started playing drum set. So I started playing, until I was the ripe old age of 13. I was convinced I was going to go be a research scientist. That was like what I wanted to do. Like I was reading all kinds of astronomy books, I was doing all kinds of stuff. And then a lot of my friends started playing music, and they started playing guitar, and my thought was like, well, I'll go learn how to play drums and maybe we'll start a band. That band never happened, but the first time I started playing drums, I knew that my life was over. I was just like, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. I feel like I don't know what my body is because it's so confusing, but it was immediately addicting. And that very shortly, like within, like, so it's hard to tell, like falling in love with playing was also right around when I started falling in love with sound. It related to music. Like there are some funny things in my childhood. Neither of my parents are musicians, but there was a lot of music around the house. But my dad, part of what he did for a living was he's a mechanic, and he loved. Well, I don't know if he loved it. I loved it as a kid, but he would always be trying to like track down weird, like sort of errant noises in an environment. So like a
mm,
squeaky door, a ticking, like like sometimes sounds would bother him, kind of like because you're working on. I think it was related to his work on cars. When you hear a random ticking or something, you kind of have to
right.
know what it is.
Oh
If
yeah.
you're a mechanic. So I really sort of I always had this sort of investigative relationship with sound from a very early age. And then as soon as I started making music, I think that really kind of clicked in. And, I started like, as any drummer does, I started trying to find random stuff to hit pretty early on in high school because, percussion instruments are expensive. So, I would just try to find stuff. And I think one of the first experiences I had where I really like set out to do a thing, like build a little setup, like a little kind of unique take on an instrument was I was in high school and we had our state music competition, like solo and ensemble, and I found out that you could actually enter with your own composition. So I wrote a composition for a snare drum with a practice pad on top and a tom tom with a tube going into the tom tom to like change the pitch, which is a trick I had picked up from Glenn Coachy. He used to have this column in Modern Drummer, and those columns, man, those columns are responsible for a lot of my like early musical career because he would do things. He'd be like, "Here's how to make shakers out of ping pong balls." It was like exactly what I was looking for. Having no money and being like a suburban kid, it's like, okay, what can I, not get in trouble about with? And so I played this piece with like a pitch changing tom tom and picking up the practice pad off the snare drum to get like different resonances. And I just, it was like kind of a goofy piece, but it was, that was I didn't think much about the fact that that was the first thing I ever wrote, but that was, it's like that's where it started. Like it's so that was really the first one where I was definitely spent weeks at a time just kind of thinking about sound in terms of percussion, and then I also spent a lot of time in high school with electronic stuff. I was fortunate enough to have sort of hand me down PC tower that I got running with like Sony Acid Pro. I don't know if you remember that program, but it's I could record my own sounds and just started trying to do stuff basically right out of the gate, and it was a really sort of important part of my, especially my high school experience.
I know so many, well, naturally, I know so many percussionists in general and drummers, and I know so many composers who are also percussionists. And my teacher in grad school, who's an amazing composer, Baljinder Sekon, is
Oh
also a
yeah,
percussionist. So, and he writes a lot of percussion music. And I just think it's interesting that, like, I think if you're a percussionist, you have no choice but to be attracted to all kinds of different sounds. And I have to
yeah,
wonder, like, it almost sounds like a chicken and an egg kind of thing, but I have to wonder, like, if you never discovered the drum set, like, how different would things have ended up? I mean, it kind of, you make it sound
yeah.
like maybe it's consequential, but also inconsequential in some ways because you're already tuned in to listening in those ways.
Yeah, it's I mean, yeah, the chicken and the egg thing is a very, very good way to put it, because there is this sort of like when your instrument, so like my first instrument was drum set. I did that before I
Yeah,
played anything else, and having an instrument that is like basically a Lego set, like they're like, this is your instrument, and it's like a bunch of boxes. That
right,
doesn't happen for a violinist. Like, you know what
right,
I
right.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
um, although I have seen a clarinetist take the middle section out of a clarinet, and I really liked that. But
Yes. Yeah, that's super
so,
cool.
but for the most part, when you start music, you're handed an object, and you're supposed to, and your relationship with that object is to make it do what it's meant to do. And then, but with percussion, it's like you have to sort of design your own instrument. You have to dial in things like tom angles and all this stuff, and the metaphor would be like if every pianist had to learn how to weight the keys into, like learn how to like change the action on their piano right when they started playing. And so yeah, I do think it's just right at the root of my relationship to making music for sure.
Yeah. I love this story about, like, you found out that you could write your own piece for solo and ensemble, and so you did. That's like, I totally relate to that. I used to do that kind of stuff all the time, like going through college, where it's like, oh, I played euphonium, by the way, so a little
Oh,
bit different.
nice.
I didn't get to like modify my instrument that much, but if at all. but
Yeah.
but yeah, like there were competitions in college where it was a performance competition. I was always so deeply unsatisfied with the repertoire I was given that I mean that's what kind of pulled me into being a composer. And so I would write my own pieces and I could write to my strengths, and it's like, oh, like people kind of like that. So I just have to point out how much I love that story. And I wonder, you're the first person to really say that you've done that. I wonder how many people also kind of experience that, you know?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I guess it must just depend on the environment of the music program. Like I remember in a recent episode of yours, Annika Sokolovsky talked about how important her high school composition opportunity was, and for me, it wasn't so much like it actually wasn't even really encouraged, but it wasn't not supported. But what it was is that like I was surrounded by a lot of marching band stuff,
Right.
and so I was exposed to things like Finale from a pretty early, from like, once I learned that like my band director was the one like writing some of the exercises and some of the cadences, I got curious about the tools they were using. And so even though I didn't like really have anybody like holding my hand in the composition process, I got really interested in like making it, just being exposed to that as like part of the ecosystem. And I don't know, that tends to happen a lot in marching bands where like percussion arrangers and stuff tend to be notation jockeys, so you gotta you gotta really you get exposed to that from an early age.
So you're currently in Indianapolis. Was did you grow up in Indiana? Is this all happening around Indianapolis?
I did. I grew up in Richmond, Indiana, which is
Oh yeah.
about an hour east of Indianapolis. Earlham College is there,
Yep.
and I had a really kind of unique musical upbringing because of the location there. Especially once I could drive. uh, I went to a very small private high school called Seton Catholic. I was actually in the second graduating class of that school. Like, it was like brand new. So it didn't even have a music program until I was a senior in high school. So I took music over at Richmond High School, and then also started going over to Earlham College because one of my high school percussion teachers was Keith Cozart over at Earlham. And that guy he was definitely like an omnivore. I learned drum set with him, but he would, you know, I learned so many other instruments with him, like berimbau. I learned conga styles from 3 different countries. I learned djembe, and then he was the one who encouraged me to play gamelan. So I got to play some Javanese gamelan in high school, which was a pretty formative experience. And then also the orchestra there was pretty small, but it was the first high school orchestra in the country, or one of them. They claim that they are. I don't, who
Yeah.
knows, a claim made that far back. But, so they had really developed like side by side programs and stuff. So really, I just tried to cram as many experiences as I could. And people, it was like that town at that time, it was like they were taking warm bodies everywhere, anywhere they could get them.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. You mentioned, being around percussion arrangers. So I'm gonna say, like, count those out. No offense,
Yeah.
marching
Oh,
band
yeah, that's
percussion
fine.
guys. But when was your first encounter with a composer? Would that have happened in your orbit around that time of high school,
Yeah.
or was it shortly after?
So my first indirect encounter with a composer, sort of that had a very personal effect on me, but I didn't end up meeting in person, was George Crumb, actually. And he came to Earlham. And so I was around when everybody was prepping for that concert. I think they played Haunted Landscape. And I remember then, even though I couldn't make it to the concert, I went and they had the record store had some of his CDs, which was crazy. So I made a deep dive into him, but just seeing sort of what he was doing was definitely my first real, like, kind of eye opening moment. Like, whoa, you can do a lot. And they had the jawbones and all these crazy instruments that are, now it feels a little genteel, but at the time, it was like these guys are playing bones on this stage.
Yeah, right.
It's pretty incredible. And so that was definitely the first one. And George Crumb, I've made the comment before that George Crumb is my Beethoven, and I really, he's one that he and Charles Ives are the two that I come back to the most in terms of orchestral music, which is maybe a bit dated, but I mean, I listen to other people, but those two are the ones that really kind of lit the fire under me in high school.
Yeah, that's incredible. I can't imagine having learned about George Crumb in high school. I
Yeah, oh,
my encounter.
yeah.
I think I've talked with some people about George Crumb on the podcast before, so I'm sure I've said this, but I'll tell you anyway, Rob.
Yeah, yeah.
That my first encounter with George Crumb was in the music library in my undergrad. I was probably like a sophomore or
Oh,
junior, in like the oversized score sections with like Star Child and like the crazy notation in a spiral and like all that kind of stuff. And just like, I don't even know if I even listened to his music. I just like saw the scores and looked through them
yeah.
and was captivated. And I mean, for sure it makes sense that you would put George Crumb on a pillar as many people do Beethoven, because it's just like he's one of those composers who rewires the way that you can think about music, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a thing I like to say to my students when I've taught the 20th century music at IU Indianapolis a few times, and my favorite line about those guys is like sometimes composers are writing music, and then sometimes composers are trying to rip the universe and slap it onto the page. And that's sometimes what, George Crumb has. He can make you feel like you're in another place in a very, very beautiful way. We could turn this into a George Crumb podcast, but we.
We'll stop while we're ahead. If you haven't, if someone listening, if you haven't listened to George Crumb's music, go look it up. Then we'll just stop there. So that was kind of like an indirect encounter. What would you say is your first direct encounter with a composer?
Honestly, my first direct encounter with other composers, you know, I hesitate to say capital C, but people who were doing it for their main profession were really when I started doing my college visits. So I was thinking, you know, the plan was to study music in undergraduate. So I did college visits at a few different places. But you know, in high school, even though I had a lot of opportunities to play and had a lot of support, the composition stuff was pretty individual for a long time. I did certainly found like an online community through a bunch of there used to be these like CDR labels out of like California and stuff, and I ran a review blog, and so I got into some pretty experimental stuff, especially towards the end of high school. I started finding some people that really kind of were like opening perspective on what you can do. Tarantel being like one of my favorite bands of all time. So it really was when I got into the academic settings that I started doing it. Earlham, I'm sure I could have there, but they didn't have a private composition teachers or anything. So my first private lesson wasn't until first semester of freshman year. And I, remember showing this poor grad student like this just completely unplayable piece. And he was explaining to me why it was unplayable. And I was just like, well, they're supposed to be good here. They can figure it out. Just completely immature. So, I was definitely for a while, I was, sort of treating notation like an extension of any other electronic music platform. It was like a way for me to make sick sounds, but it wasn't necessarily tied to reality.
Right. You were describing like this first piece for solo and ensemble that you composed. Were you composing quite a bit kind of in the interim between that moment and when you went to college, or was it just like kind of here and there?
It's hard to say it's hard to say exactly like those two things would have been right around each other. Like, because I remember, so I was fortunate enough to have a copy of Finale maybe my sophomore year of high school. So I wonder how I convinced my parents to pay for that. That would have been a real Tom Sawyer moment. But I remember, so in that time when I was writing, so I was playing a lot of percussion music that was newer. So like tap space, some of the tap space stuff. Like I was sort of in tune with the fact that new music was being written for percussion, and that was a normal thing. But I remember having Finale before I did that solo and ensemble piece because I couldn't write some of the rhythms I wanted to write in Finale, specifically doing some frankly lazy metric modulations. I mean, they're notationally easier to write, but flipping flipping numerators and denominators and stuff. But it was all kind of happening right around that time. So I was kind of doing everything. I was throwing spaghetti at a wall. My drums and my computer were relegated to the basement, and so I kind of had like a space to just kind of explore down there. So yeah, it was all kind of happening right around the same time. And after that solo and ensemble piece, the one piece I did, I released a record on a label called Phantom Limb. And a record, it was a CDR, but it was and I think half the reason that they agreed to release it was because I was so young, which was very nice of them. And then but I wrote a lot of that in Finale, and then transported it over to MIDI. So like exported it as MIDI, brought it into another program, and orchestrated it for synths. Yeah, so there was a lot of activity, like sending out demos and getting rejected. I loved like posting rejections on my bedroom wall for a while. So yeah, it was all kind of happening like right around the same time. I feel very fortunate in the sense that like, now that I'm thinking about it, I had sort of like a different ways of interfacing with music from basically, the first couple of years. Yeah, because sheet music wasn't always it. Gamelan you learn by memory, like all that, some of this, I had different ways of cataloging what I was doing.
Well, and as a non-percussionist who has composed plenty for percussion, it's almost like you're kind of making up your legend anyway, and like
Yeah.
like the rules of dynamics and articulation and rhythm still apply, but it's like
Yeah.
otherwise you're kind of like trying to, it feels like reinventing the wheel every piece
Right.
anyway.
Oh,
So
totally.
that makes sense.
And those of you who have wrestled with multi-percussion parts in Finale or Sibelius or anything, we all know the pain of just slogging through that.
Yep, for sure. So, okay, so we're at the end of your high school time. Can you share a bit of an overview and connect the dots, like where you go to college? You know, I mean, I think you mentioned earlier before we started recording that, it's been about 10 years since grad school or something like that. So, like, connect the dots of your creative journey a little bit. I mean, do you feel like you have followed a more conventional path, or do you feel like it was more unexpected twists, or somewhere in between?
I think, I think that um it's definitely been a long sort of like winding road. The best parts of which are when I've just sort of allowed myself to be myself and not and sort of gotten out of my own way in terms of institutions and stuff. And so, first moment kind of like that was, I was at a very small high school, and so I wanted to go to the biggest school I could. And my parents, I love them to death. We still have a great relationship. But at the time, I was their oldest child, so they were like begging me to stay in state. And so I was like, okay, the biggest school I can go to with a good music program is IU. I didn't have anybody in my immediate sphere that really understood how hard it was to get in IU in the mid aughts. It was some of those performers, and I'm sure they still are. The only reason I say it in past tense is because that's when I was there. But back then, I mean, there would be 18-year-olds that go into that program, and it's like, I'm never going to play as good my entire life, and I'm not even interested in that. You know what I mean? Like, and so I went to IU and auditioned hilariously. I mean, knew I failed the audition 2 minutes in because I remember they handed me a tuning fork and four timpani. They handed me like an A tuning fork, and they were like, tune these four timpani. And I was like, you only gave me one tuning fork.
Yeah.
So I was like, just completely
Right.
unprepared for my percussion audition. But the composers kind of liked me. So, and this was fairly typical at Jacobs. Like, you might be really close, and Jacobs was good enough that some people were willing to put the time in to like make it in. So I started in this track called pre-music. So I was able to take like theory or like major level theory. I was able to take applied lessons in composition and percussion with grad students. And so for that first year, I took a few music classes, like theory and all that. I think I even took an orchestration class one semester, and thinking I was going to go to that music school, especially for the fall semester. And then, shortly, what happened is, I started making friends, which, coming from a small place, like it was like I had never really had like a large and diverse like social life before. So that sort of started to take over. And I had also taken a class called God and the Human Condition. I'm not sure how often this happens, but that professor stopped me after class one day and was like, "You should consider philosophy." And in high school, I had several semesters with this sort of like really nerdy young priest theology. He wanted theology class to be serious, and that has paid off because he taught it more like a philosophy class. So I had this foundation I didn't even know that I had, and sort of rode that wave. So I made the decision to switch to philosophy, and at the same time had fallen in with a group of people that lived in Bloomington, and immediately started falling into local shows there. So I was in basements, and you kind of had to tag along with an older student because if they caught freshmen in there, they'd kick you out. Like, don't drink. You don't want to get the cops called, that kind of thing. Or if you drink, be smart about it. But so I immediately got dropped into this music scene that at the time was just unbelievable. Just it
And
was.
this was separate from IU school.
It was
Jacobs School of
separate.
Music.
It was
Yeah.
separate from Jacobs School, but at the same time, I was going to a lot of concerts at Jacobs School. It's just like that was where my freshman year was like when I saw my first opera, like major opera production. I saw La Traviata, and the set design there. It's like it's almost on par with the Met there. In fact,
Yeah.
they designed their theater to be sort of a training ground for the Met. It's got the same backstage layout, and so I got to see a lot of really cool stuff there too. Like Verdi's Requiem was that year. I'll never forget that performance. And bunch of new music stuff. They did the arrangements for chamber orchestra of like Aphex Twin, who was a really Aphex Twin was influential on me in high school and college. So like, yeah, I was going to everything. I was going to basements, I was going to concert halls, and really was doing a lot of music. And the philosophy stuff, it was like I had made this sort of decision. I was like, I'm going to study philosophy in school. Maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll be a lawyer. Maybe I'll be whatever. But music is clearly what I want to do with my life. So stick with a major I'm good at, and then do the music stuff as much as I can outside of that. And continued to write music reviews for the first 2 years of college until I got a little burnt out on that. And then, so yeah, IU was like this whole thing. And then eventually, I had a period of like pretty heavy depression about 3 years into college, and I ended up dropping out. I stuck around for like that last year in Bloomington when my friends were still in school and really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Moved back to Richmond with my parents and started working for my dad, which, thank God, he ended up, we ended up parting ways professionally, and it saved our relationship. But that period was like, I went back to Richmond. I had, really no friends to speak of. I had no interest in a social life there because I was still, even though I had been humbled by life and sort of my, learning that, sometimes things hit you hard that you have no control over. I still sort of had this better than you vibe, which, I don't, I don't really like now, but at the time it kept me motivated. And I ended up running into this guy in Starbucks in Richmond, and Starbucks at the time is a big deal that Starbucks had moved to Richmond. It was the only coffee shop in town left because the local one had folded. And I walked in and there's a guy using a MIDI controller. And I was like, accosted him. I was like, who are you and what are you doing here? Like, what, like, and we started talking, and I think he realized like I knew a thing or two. And he was like, well, I just started a music program at the IU campus here. Why don't you just come finish your degree? Like, you need to finish your degree. Like, you're going to need it for your life. Like, why don't you spend the last year making music? And so that last year, I took like every credit hour I could, had no life, and ended up, but did finish an undergrad. I think it's some weird undergraduate degree, like humanities with a music focus, because my philosophy credits didn't transfer over. So like that major didn't even exist at IU East.
Right.
They transferred as credits, but so it's just, but that's an unexpected turn. And Elliot, his name is Elliot McKinley, is a fantastic composer. I think he's the professor up at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island now. But he was the real deal. And like, he was brutal in a way that I really enjoyed, like for like advanced harmony, he would make us write like thousands of chord connections. I mean, it was brutal. And he was using the Schoenberg book to teach advanced harmony, the Schoenberg Theory of Harmony book.
Yeah.
And he was cracking up. Like, he knew how funny it was, but he's like, I've got all these kids that are like willing to put in the work. And we had a good group of guys there. And I'm using that unisex. It was actually a pretty diverse crowd, but we ended up going to Italy and participating in a music festival. So that was the first time I got to hear a piece of mine played by another ensemble that I had never met or worked with at all. I got to write a little woodwind quintet for them. And yeah, so that really set me off. And then after I graduated, I knew that I needed to leave Richmond and really get out from under there. So I decided, I was kind of on the fence between Austin and Chicago. Ultimately decided that I wanted to take a winter off. Like, it's like I've seen as many winters as years I've been alive. Why not have a year without one? So drove to Austin and really, honestly, like went down there to get a responsible job. And I wanted to sort of hang the music thing up, to be honest. Like, it was sort of this thing where I think it was wrapped up in ideas of shame for me in certain ways, because it was like, because I wasn't allowing myself to do it to the extent that I wanted, I was always frustrated, and then I was taking out my frustration in other ways. And so there was this moment, that I just was like, all right, I'm going to move to Austin. I'm going to get a job. And then, maybe I'll play music down there, and it's a music town. So I knew I'd see a lot of music. Like, I was never, I never wanted to stop listening to music. But went down there, did end up getting a job. And shortly after I got my own apartment, I would still noodle around with music for sure, and then I remember seeing this program called Sunvox, which is a Russian synthesizer program. It's a modular interface. It looks crazy. Completely obliterates skeuomorphism, which is like skeuomorphism. For those of you who don't know, is like anytime you see a texture that's like a wooden texture or anything like this is like no textures, no like cables. Like cables are just lines. Like it's the most
Yeah.
bare bones interface you can get to, and I had one of those moments where I was like, I don't understand this at all. So I think I'm going to try to figure it out. And then that turned into this very large project. But like all of a sudden, within a few months, I sort of realized that I was composing like 6 to 8 hours a day again. And this little synthesizer program had become like counterpoint boot camp. Like I was like, writing canons and fugues and in the like sort of the guise of like this like 8-bit video game music sounding stuff. And so I finished that, and had gotten a different job working remotely. And so after about a year and a half in Austin, I moved to Indianapolis, specifically to save up to go to grad school. So at that point I knew I was going to go to grad school. And I had that moment, I think a lot of us do, if you're sort of on the alinear path. I think there's a moment where you realize, okay, this is important to me. This is important enough to me, like regardless of how my aunts and uncles feel, how it feels in a traditional lifestyle, whether or not it's productive. There's a part of me that if I don't try this, like if I don't really just give myself over to it, forget every other concern in the world, then I will regret it. I'll wake up 10 years down the road and I'll be crazy and I won't know why. And so I moved back to save up for grad school. The rent in Indianapolis at that time was, oh my God, it's like $275 a month. It was so cheap. And it was, again, one of those things, I've had a few moments of like right time, right place, right time, right people, which I'm incredibly grateful for. Bloomington was one of those times. Indianapolis at that time was one of those times. Ended up moving into a house that I think just burned down. I should check on it. But just had three of my two people I didn't know, and then one of my childhood friends lived there. All the trappings of living with a childhood friend. If you've ever tried to live with a childhood friend, it can be a rough thing. But
it's tough sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, but he's great. He's great. We have since remained friends. But it was like 2 blocks away from, or like a block away from Fountain Square. I mean, it's in the Fountain Square neighborhood, but like a block away from the main drag in Fountain Square. And at that time in Indianapolis, the art scene had just sort of coalesced to this neighborhood. The rent was cheap. The general reputation of the neighborhood was still that it was dangerous, even though everyone walking around just looked homeless because they were artists. It was like, it felt, yeah, from the outside, there was a brief period where like businesses didn't want to move in there, but there was a big building where they had bought it and turned it into like 40 art galleries, like a big block long building. So there was just stuff happening there. It was just like you could just walk out. Like if you were bored, you could just walk outside and just see who else was walking around outside and see what was going on. It felt a lot like college in that way. And so that made me fall in love with Indianapolis in a very special way too, where, when I was a kid, Indianapolis was like, malls and like Payless shoe stores. Like those were my memories of Indianapolis growing up. But, I came here and found this really, really vibrant and welcoming music scene. It was like once I walked, the red carpet was rolled out for me. And then in turn, I realized that's how everybody was to people who came to town. So like I've had the opportunity to roll out the red carpet for people, but
yeah,
that time, especially that first year, was really just like a incubator. Like I started playing shows again. I started like, playing solo shows. And then also that year there was a crazy coincidence where in that big building down the block for me that I described that had like, it's called the Murphy Building. And at the time, there's a record label that some people might know called Joyful Noise Records. And like they put out Deerhoof and a few fairly notable bands, but they had their headquarters and a venue at the top of this building. And in 2014, I saw this flyer that was like, it might have said New Directions in Percussion Music or something. And it was in November. And for percussionists talking about Indianapolis in November, like, that like your bell's going off. It's like, oh, this is probably related to PASIC, but it was like this show. And I think Tim Feeney, Aaron Butler, gosh, who else did I meet there? I think Robert Honstein. That might be wrong. That's a little iffy, but there was a bunch of people there, and I saw these guys. I remember that was the first time I saw somebody like pitch bend a wine glass, and I got that old, like, I had sort of left the classical music thing a little bit behind, but I got that old sort of like fire where I was like, oh, that's a gorgeous sound, and I'm furious I didn't think of it. So it was like, and so I talked to everybody I could without seeming like a crazy person, because it was like I had come home. It was like all of a sudden I was just like, oh my gosh, this is like what I've been looking for my entire life. And so that's ended up like making connections with one guy, Aaron Butler, who ended up like recording a glockenspiel solo for me for my grad school portfolio, like just because I needed it, like he was just one of the, like, it was a really welcoming sort of space. And so then shortly after that, about fast forward about a year from there, or like, to the next like July, and I've gotten into grad school. I decided to go to Butler. I decided to stay in Indy and do grad school, which I hadn't really considered an option, except the comp professors up there. I remember calling him on the phone, like the office phone, and he picked up. And I was like, oh, hey. And I, talked to him, and he was like, we should get lunch, and then like that was, and that was basically it. And so I knew I was staying in Indy, and I had kept hearing rumors about a percussion museum in the basement of a mall. And that just sounds like a fever dream. Like that doesn't, so like a few people had told me about it, and I was like, what are you guys talking about? Like, are you talking about like the display case at the Hard Rock Cafe? What is going on? And so it was right before school started. It was like a couple weeks, maybe a week, maybe even a week into school. I was at a concert. I saw a guy who had a film festival polo on, and I knew him as a guy who worked for a lot of nonprofits. I just saw him out everywhere. And it was the first time I hadn't had a full-time job in years. And so I was going a little stir crazy and need something to fill up some of my spare time. So I asked him, I was like, hey, you work for some nonprofits. I'm a grad student. Do you know of any part-time work? And again, he was like, oh, I work at a drum museum on the weekends, and we're actually looking for someone. I'm like, I'm sorry, is this the one in the basement of the mall? And he's like, yeah, actually. And I was like, so like, and I had gone looking for this thing. It turns out it's in the basement of a building adjacent to Circle Center Mall, which is downtown. And so it was like, I had gone to the mall proper. I'd never been able to find it. But it turns out if you cross this big airwalk, you go downstairs beneath the Panera Bread, then unfolds 14,000 square feet of percussion. And so that again, right place, right time, right people. I started working there on the weekends, and I'm used to having a lot to do. So that was definitely like, I was just like, well, 2 days is nice, but if I can be useful enough to work like 3 or 4 days, I'll just keep being useful. I'll just, show up early, stay late, do the whole thing. And so slowly I took on, well, actually rather quickly, after like 2 weeks of working there, or maybe 3 weeks, it was November again. And this was the last time PASIC was outside of Indianapolis. So I think maybe it was a month of working there. And then they leave for November. So then I just ran the museum for a week, basically with no training. And like one of the first days I got there, the alarm was going off, and I met who was at the time the collections intern. Her name is Elizabeth, and immediately sort of like, became friends with her, and she had me do this crazy project. Turns out, in retrospect, I realized she was having me do this crazy project because she knew she could get away with it because all the staff was gone. But she also never had been the first one there, so she didn't know there was an alarm. It was comedy from the beginning. But then she and I ended up, after grad school, I stayed at Rhythm Discovery Center, ended up getting a full-time position. And that defined like the next like 6 years of my life, was running that museum. Worked with Elizabeth and several other people, and getting to know that collection was really interesting. As an instrument nerd from the very beginning, it was again like one of those things where people are asking me questions and I'm just like, oh, I do know that. Like I actually know. So like I read this at some point in high school, and it's rattling around back there. So ended up really liking it and worked there basically until it flooded in December of 2022, I guess, like right at the beginning of 2023. But yeah, so I stayed in Indianapolis and started really trying to put on concerts both through the museum, through playing out in other venues, and really just tried to make a lot of friends, and ended up like around 2018 there was a group in Indianapolis, like a new Pierrot ensemble was starting. They're called Forward Motion. They're excellent. So there were a few of us, like right after grad school and graduated like 2017, I believe. And then, there was a group of us that really wanted to just start building an independent classical scene here in Indianapolis. So I worked a lot with them. I worked a lot with an organization called Classical Music Indie. I was like an advisor for a magazine they put out for several years, and kept working in the museum. And I had a really good setup at the museum where, in grad school, I had gotten very used to having, even when I was working and doing classes, I'd gotten very used to having composition time, which is the luxury of every student. If you're in grad school listening to this, use all of your free time to compose because it will dissipate. But I came to my boss, Joshua Simons. He's still the executive director of PAS. He's a very good dude. And I told him, I was like, look, working 5 days a week is killing me. And I think I can get most of my duties done in 4. And he was like, well, do you want to work longer days? Like, what's the thing here? I was like, no, just cut my pay by 20%. Like, put me at the minimum hours. That'll get me insurance. I'll work harder because I'll be more motivated. And then I'll have enough time to do the things I want to do outside of this. I don't think anyone in his life had ever gone to him and requested, like argued for a pay cut. But it ended up being, for both of us, I think one of the best decisions that I made at that time, because it did allow me like that extra money. I just was like, okay, I got to make a little extra money doing music. And so I was able to take more commissions and just write for a bunch of people. I think throughout those years, I went to SOSI a few times, the So Percussion Summer Institute, and was their TA my last year, which was really fun. That festival was another sort of moment where like you go home, and it was kind of interesting. A lot of the people there are students, and for the last 2 years I was there, I was mostly working full time, and so those 2 weeks were like my vacation. It like felt like I had a very different mentality, but it was good. I met so many people that I still am in contact with there, and really, it was another one of those environments where you just like you see that like you should make the music. You should just be as honest to yourself as you can about the music you want to make. And then, after, since basically COVID interrupted everything as, for everybody. And then after COVID, my last few years here have really been colored by this organization, Sound Ecologies, which I met those guys and I knew they were presenting concerts. And, if you've ever interfaced with large groups of composers, sometimes it can be a little sort of, competitive, is like the gentlest way to say that. But it was almost like a fever dream. Like all these guys were super nice, and they were like, "Oh, do you want to write for us?" And I was like, "Sure," and it was like the kind of like lack of pretense, hyper enthusiastic, and just really supportive environment that I realized. And then, I kind of dipped my toes in there, and then I was like, "Hey, I think you could organize." I started like gently, and they were like, and then finally I called them and I was like, "Hey, I know this is your thing, but I'd really love to be maybe more involved, if that's okay." Like it's because it was Luke Garrigus and Logan Purcell are the two who started it, and they were just like, no, yeah, please, So then that really, then we started working as a team, and we have a team of 6 artistic directors now that all put on things. And yeah, and then throughout all of the rest of the time, it's kind of hard to say. There's like always been multiple threads, but I've always maintained a healthy like solo performance practice,
Yeah.
like throughout the whole thing, which maybe we can talk a little bit more about in a bit. But that's
Yeah.
basically it. That's the journey. It's like I got to Indianapolis and things just kept keeping me here. I mean, the one time I thought about leaving seriously was I had gotten accepted to a doctorate program, and I was really on the fence. A lot of good things were happening here. I think that it was 2019, and that year, like I had put on a performance of like Strange and Sacred Noise in a park that was like attended by like over 100 people. Like things were happening here. Like it felt like real in a certain way. Like I was getting momentum. Obviously, I didn't know what was going to happen in 2020, but I called Andrea Mazzariello, who's I think he's the professor up at Carleton University, and he's the comp teacher at SOSI, at the So Percussion Summer Institute. So after grad school, he was the comp teacher I interfaced with the most. And he gave me some of the best life advice I ever got in that moment, which is like, if you're torn between staying where you are and where you're going, interrogate the parts of your life that are provisional on other external frameworks. He's like, consider whether or not you're going to get a doctorate because it'll make you happy or because you think it's what you should do. Because if you just think it's what you should do without knowing what that means for you, and you're doing all this stuff already, like the doctorate is supposed to, education is
Right.
supposed to be a key to opportunities. So if you're already creating opportunities, why would you, and he just kind of broke it open for me in a way. And that was really, it really did. Like that conversation really kind of clarified a lot of things for me. And then I decided to stay in Indy, had all this ambition to put on a bunch of shows in 2020. Obviously that didn't happen. But it led to the artist residency that I have now. I have a very unique artist residency with used to be Big Car. It is now the Contemporary Art Museum of Indianapolis. That's a recent change, and we're about to open a 70,000 square foot building, which is exciting. But I have a residency with them where I co-own my house with them. So it's a land trust essentially, and so I sort of married myself to this organization and their mission, and they do a lot of community work, and placemaking is a big buzzword they use, but they do a lot of like public art and ton of murals, ton of like interactive activities. We also do a big thing where there's a big dumb roundabout in the center of our town called Monument Circle, which should be a pedestrian space, but it's really just the world's biggest, dumbest roundabout right now. But during the summer, we close it off and turn it into a park. And I'm hoping, I think there's more attention being paid that space is really cool when it's a park. Like we get average is a little over 1,500 visitors a day, I think. And so like some days it's packed, and people they're just doing stuff, just like, and there's some art activities and stuff, but they're just hanging out, and it's like a nice space to be. But yeah, so I bought my house in 2020 and have since been very involved with that organization, and they like me to just do my thing. Like part of my value with them is just being active. But that's been it so far in terms of where I've lived.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating story, and I feel a lot of there's a lot of parallels between my own journey with what you're describing, in that I've sometimes gotten a little too self-conscious about like, oh, I wear a lot of hats. I'm a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and I tend to put composer at the top of that list, even though my daily life doesn't always reflect that. But it's like that's how
Yeah.
I kind of move through the world. So I guess before I ask my next question, like, how do you orient yourself as a composer around all of these different things that you're describing?
Yeah.
You're a percussionist, you're a performer, otherwise you're an artistic director. Like how does all that fit together?
Okay, it's tricky. The last few years have been what I would describe. I don't say this as a pat on the back. I say this with a little bit of caution. But the last like 2.5 years have been very high output. So the way I've kept composition sort of at the fore for me is I have sort of changed my relationship to it. So I've had a lot of, with Sound Ecologies and a few other places, I've had a lot of opportunities to write chamber music, and it's kind of come in two ways. So like sometimes I'll get a big commission, right? Like, or big for me, like enough to where I can take time off of any other job and sit and think about things. a lot of times sometimes I'll write for little to no money just because I like the performer and I'm interested in the opportunity. But the last, especially the last 2 full years, I've written and had performed, I think like over 25 pieces. And so part of it was just forcing myself to do it, just committing, like treating it like a job, and also radically letting go of like I used to feel this trepidation every time I'd put on a piece. Like, this is the masterpiece. This is the one that's everybody's gonna see it. Everybody's gonna see me in a way. And what I've sort of replaced that with this like sort of desire to be like, I mean, I do like pieces that take a long time to write, think about every single thing. I do think about every single thing when I write a piece, but like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, there's certain things where it's like, just really, trying to get to the experience of like making music with your friends. And so a lot of it is just like, oh yeah, I'm going to write this like 4-minute piano piece and it's going to do one thing and it's going to be a thing that I like. And it's going to, and it's maybe it will not make me see harmony in a profoundly new way, or maybe it will not make me, but it inevitably does. I just don't start out with any of those. I don't often start out with any of those big life questions. There are some exceptions to that. I wrote a couple orchestral pieces, 3 orchestral pieces in the last 2 years, all of which have been, I have 4. Sorry. The 4th one was for a community orchestra. So that was an arrangement of something else. So that one didn't feel quite so tense. But there are a few that have really taken a toll. But I think the main thing is just really, I try to make that the goal, like composing the goal, and then everything else is sort of life outside of it, in the sense that like, you have to sort of have hobbies outside of what you do. And for me, I'm a very social person, and that can go a bunch of different ways. It can mean I just go out and party all the time, but also for me, what it means is like being like setting up my life so I can be involved in things that I like the organization down the street,
for sure.
Classical music indie. I do some outreach work for Progressive Art Society, doing drum circles. So it's sort of like trying those other activities kind of feed into composition. Because for me, composition and also instrument building, which I know we'll get to, are sort of the distillation of like everything, all the experiences of having everything I'm learning. And so it's important to me to be sort of this kind of like Swiss Army knife in order to be an effective sort of community member and neighbor. And a lot of times, with a lot of what I'm doing, it does take this sort of technical thing. Like, I've produced all the recordings for Sound Ecologies over the last 2 years. I do, because I started this sort of as very DIY or die kind of person, sort of growing into, frankly, like a citizen is sort of what I've been focused on the last couple of years. And that's how I balance it. It's like, I really try to find like, it's hard, because there are so many activities. And this year, we can talk about this, like this year, my whole goal is just to be organized. But I think that's how I sort of rationalize it, is like all these other activities kind of feed into composition and are feeding into, just kind of how I like the perspective that I'm coming from.
Yeah, I love this idea of distillation because I completely agree, and it took me so long to come to that conclusion myself. And like I said, I was like subconscious in this way that it's like, well, do people really even take me seriously as a composer because I'm doing this other stuff to like make a living, and then like
Yeah.
it finally dawned on me like, oh, it's like two different sides of the same expression. It's
Yeah.
like it's all the same, and it's all because of the way it's moving through me, right? And
Right.
I loved what you said about asking your boss for less hours to have more time composing, because so it's January, it's like almost mid-January 2026. About a month ago, I left my longtime, day job, air quotes,
Yeah.
in radio. And ultimately I came to that conclusion, like and there's a lot of reasons why I left, but the most important one and the most public reason, I'll say, is I've left to focus more on my creative activities. It's like
Yeah.
that was something like when I made the list for every day and everything like kind of piled up. It's like, well, that's the first thing to go, or that's the thing that's living on the back burner the longest, and I just need to reorganize my life in a way. And the stars kind of align that have allowed me to do that. But man, like I've spent the past month like, how do I actually prioritize composition? Like it's like,
Yeah.
it's a lot of hard work to be able to just, and finally I just realized like, okay, I'm going to sit down tomorrow first thing. I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to compose
Hmm.
for the first 2 hours of my day. And it was like the world opened up for me.
Oh yeah,
And
sitting
then
down and actually doing it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's it. That's it. Oh, okay, okay. But then that's the hard part is things have come up and I haven't been able to do that. So
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't really have like a direction that I'm taking that. It's just I feel you. I totally know where you're coming from.
Yeah, I do think, there's been periods in my life where, and I should say this, like I've taken a bit of, well, what for me is a bit of a long break from writing, which is like maybe 4 weeks, like where I realized my avoidance was actually like a deep need for a break. And I was like, okay, well, I'm going to write to this. And it was an unpaid piece. I liked the ensemble and I just wrote to him. I was like, hey, I'm just realizing I'm not going to get this done anywhere near when you need it. Hope that's all right. And they had already, thankfully, it was kind of the stars aligned. They'd already decided to push the concert. So I'm going to write it now, so but yeah, like just the joy of like figuring out the time to just like sit down and do it. And also the ability to make 20 minutes useful is a
Oh
muscle you
yeah.
can grow.
Yes.
And so I've been working on that again, where it's like, okay, because normally, there's a great essay by Neil Stevenson talking about how he can get 4 times as much work as he can do, 4 times as much work done in 4 hours as he can in 2 hours. And he talks about why that is. And I think that the essay is called "Why I Don't Answer Emails Quickly," and it's like really, I think is basically the title, or
Yeah.
that'll Google it for you. But yeah, just like I oftentimes I tie composition to these long periods of undistracted time, and so that has been another way to navigate. It's like, okay, this piece needs to be done, and you actually don't have like a 6 hour serene candle next to you, sip cup of tea time, so you're gonna actually need to like write it at a coffee shop and think about it while you're doing some other work that doesn't require your whole brain, and
Yep.
come back to it. And it's kind of brutal. I don't recommend it for long, but it is like it
Right.
is a good muscle to have in your back pocket for when that life creeps up on you.
Totally. I met my wife Susanna about 10 years ago. She's also a composer. I think anyone who
Yeah.
listens knows Susanna by now. And of course, Rob, you've met her. But when we first met about 10 years ago and I was like in grad school, she would joke like, yeah, Tyler could take a manuscript into the woods and just like compose on a stump or something, which was kind of true. Like I often found myself like, I was like at the airport gate, just like literally with like pen and paper, just like composing. And I had like a little bit MIDI keyboard out and it's like, okay, I have about 30 minutes and like I would get real work done. And then you're right, it is a muscle because that's gone away. And now I'm kind of like, man, I really wish I could actually do that. But I kind of have to reorient myself now, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, you'll just have to start scheduling micro composition time between your
Yeah,
calls.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's important. So, okay.
Yeah.
So with all of this in mind, with how you have chosen to prioritize your own composing output and composing time, um, brings me to the question that I ask everybody, which is when did you know that you wanted to pursue your craft as a career, and
Oh,
pursue composition as a career?
yeah. I mean, there were 2 times. I mean, like definitely it was kind of like sort of love at first hit with drums. Like it was just like I knew, like right then I knew my life was profoundly different. Like I just knew. So it's sort of that first moment, and then it was again. I just talked about it briefly, that moment in Austin when I realized I was, unbeknownst to myself, just like all of a sudden like composing like 6 or 8 hours a day, and I was like, this is it. Like this is what I want to do. Like it's and I'm I feel really, and blessed is probably the most succinct word for it, in the sense that like I still find that magic like most of the time I go to concerts. Like there's always at least one moment where I'm like, oh yeah, all right, it was worth it. Even if I'm in a bad mood, or like dragging myself to go to it. Like and so that was the moment. I think going in Austin and realizing that, like left to my own devices, I had a job that was paying the rent. I had a comfortable apartment. My roommate had a PlayStation, which I, could have spent my time with, like, and all this stuff I could have spent my time with. And that's really when I was very comfortable with myself. That was the thing I was choosing to spend my time with,
Yeah.
and it wasn't even comfortable. It was on an iPad. I mean, it was an iPad 1, like an original iPad. It wasn't even fun to use. And if that was, if that's what you do, like that's it. And yeah, I think that was the moment for me that really kind of set it off. That I was like, okay, I'm going to go back. I'm going to start looking at grad school. I'm going to at least, grad school for me was, I wanted to get a level of training that I hadn't gotten in undergrad, not doing it full time. So like, I was writing music for myself the whole time and that kind of thing. But I really wanted some chops, like I wanted to be pushed. And so knowing that, like that was, what kind of set the whole thing off.
Tyler here, breaking in just briefly to tell you about something I think you're really going to love, and that's Living Classical, my new independently produced radio show. And if you're listening to Music Maker for the ideas and philosophies behind how composers think, well, Living Classical is where you hear how that music actually comes to life. New episodes release weekly on Sundays at livingclassicalradio.com or on our Mixcloud page. So I think it was about 9 months ago now, maybe 6 months ago, that I sat down with a good friend of mine, Graham Shields, who's a composer organist, and like the podcast became all about organ. So
happens.
I feel like that's about to happen with us. So folks listening, this is about to be an instrument building, composing podcast. So yeah, you're the first instrument builder that I've had on the show, and it's not just like this thing you do on the side. It's not like a hobby. It's like, it seems very integrated with your compositional output. So I'm curious to know, I mean, I think you've kind of indirectly answered this already, but what initially drew you into the practice of instrument building, and when did building instruments stop being like this kind of experiment and start just becoming the way that you think as a composer?
It started off in high school. Like I think I mentioned, it started off like small, like building a lot of shakers out of ping pong balls and stuff. And, just flatly ripping off every idea I could see in Glenn Cochie's, either his articles or pictures of his drum set. And then where it really started to come together for me, I made a few other things. Like I make kalimbas. I still make kalimbas today. My house is lousy with them. And I made this drum called a Hank drum. You can search it. It's like basically like a poor man's hang drum.
Yeah.
Well, which are now at the time, it was when the hang drums were like that thing. You had to like go to the Swiss mansion or whatever and like build a relationship with the instrument. And you had to be in a lottery to have the privilege of buying a $10,000 instrument. But, and you had to like pay for your own travel to Switzerland. But so now we know them as like hand pans, I think. So they're everywhere. Bane of a lot of people's existence. But you can make one by cutting. Basically, if you turn a propane tank into a tongue drum. So that was the first one I made where I was like, this is great. Like I made this object and now I get to have like build the same kind of relationship to it that I did with like snare drum, for example, but it's like, it's mine. And in some ways, like I'm responsible, if it sounds bad, like I need to work on it, but it's like, it also sort of jettisoned a little bit of reverence that I have for instruments, like contrary to what someone who sees some of my work might think, like if I see an instrument, my immediate thought is not to destroy it. Like it is to like, I have a deep respect for musical instruments as, for what they are, but that sort of freedom to like, I remember I left a kalimba in a car one day and my friend was like, well, what if it breaks? And I was like, I'll build another one, so like that kind of freedom is one thing. And then really it was the economy and then pursuit of sound. So there was a moment in 2009 Now this is one of those moments that is burned in my brain forever. It was between, I believe, freshman and sophomore years of, or maybe it was 2008. Uh, it was either between freshman and sophomore year or sophomore and junior year of college. I was working for my dad during the summer. I had just chopped my hair off. I had hair about as long as I have now. And the first day I was working on cars back home, I immediately was like, nope, that long hair is terrible. I was sweating. It was oily. So I had just chopped off my hair. I was having like a whole Samson moment. And then I got a phone call from my friend Dylan, and he offered me a spot opening for this band Peaking Lights. And they've done some stuff. I think they were on Not Fun Records, and they definitely had their moment on college radio. But they put out a record in 2009 that I was just obsessed with. Like that was like my record of the summer. And so getting offered that gig, I just immediately said yes, and we had a conversation and I was really gracious. And then I hung up the phone and I realized I had no idea what I was going to do. Because at that time, the percussion stuff and I was making electronic music, and I think the reason he asked me to play was I had just put out a tape on his label called El Tule, and I realized it was like the only instrument I owned that I would want to play live. Like I like the idea of bringing, at that point, like bringing laptops live was kind of unheard of. Also,
Right.
this show was going to be in a basement.
Yeah.
So it's like the thought of bringing my laptop made me sick. Like I was just like, I don't, that doesn't sound appealing to me as a performance. I had some metal objects, and that's when I built sort of my first rack of metal mixing bowls. So I had like a card table and this like really crappy rack that I built out of copper pipe, which looking back, metal prices now, like it's like a $500 rack. But back then, copper pipe was cheaper and easier to work on. So I had built a stand for a marimba out of pipe during high school. So I kind of knew what I was doing. It wasn't a very good rack, to be honest. It fell over all the time. Well, not all the time, but more often than you would like. And so I immediately was like, okay, well, I don't want to play drum set live solo. I don't have that in me. But all this, gamelan was really in my brain at that point, which is all metal percussion. For those of you who don't know, it's like Indonesian percussion music, a lot of metallic stuff. And so I went to Walmart and just went to Walmart, Goodwill, hit all the spots and grabbed all the metal mixing bowls I could find. And I think I had one before that I played around with and really liked, like I was like, oh, metal bowl sounds great. That was the beginning for me where I was like, okay, I'm going to take this and this is going to be my life for a while, is playing metal mixing bowls. So that's when the practice really became sort of a thing. Like that doesn't sound like building an instrument, like the same way like building a guitar is, but it was like, okay, I'm going to sort of gather this stuff together and I need to figure out a performance language to like match it. And that was the moment where it really sort of became central to my musical identity. And then it was also sort of the beginning of like, my creative practice is a few different threads. So there's like the concert music stuff, there's my solo stuff, there's collaborating with others, but that was the first one where I was like, okay, I'm gonna stake this is where I'm planting my flag. It's absurd, but I really like these sounds, and I'm gonna sort of pursue it. And so that was sort of the beginning for me. That was the moment where I knew it was gonna be a part of my practice for a long time, and definitely like that led to more experiments and then as I was able to get bigger spaces, I was able to build more instruments and
Yeah.
yeah.
It's kind of funny because as you're describing this, I have you have a page on your website, which I'll link to in the show notes, that is dedicated to your instrument builds, and you have really wonderful documentation when you go through and click. But it's kind of dawning on me now, some of these instruments have like instrument names and then other ones kind of like they have it's almost like piece titles, like
Yeah.
daffodil is the name of an instrument, or left and right roses, or Purple Boy, I love the stupid thing. Like there's like a humor to it.
Yeah,
Bleeding
yeah.
Heart. I mean, so I mean, we probably don't have time to like dig into each one of
Oh,
those,
sure, sure, sure.
but like to me, it seems like yeah, it's just all interconnected. You're thinking about the instruments as a composer, as if they're pieces,
Mm-hmm.
but then as actual objects and instruments. I mean, what's the distinction between, for example, Bleeding Heart, which is very kind of abstract, and singing plates, which I think people can kind of draw a conclusion to what that is.
so that's actually a very funny story. So a few of these came from a solo exhibition I did in 2022. I did a solo exhibition called Study in Place, where I had this crazy idea to like fill a room with instruments and sculptures that I built. And the line there between the two is very it's not a line to me. You know, it's like sort
Yeah,
of they're
sure.
both the same practice. At the same time, I was during COVID, another artist on my block named Justin Cooper, who is just the model of, you know, when we talk about quality of life stuff, he's like my sage. Like I go and, you know, he's usually like, well, did you make music today? And I'm like, no, I didn't. He's like, well, that's what's wrong. Go home, stop, like leave and
Yeah,
go make
yeah,
some
yeah.
music, you know, and he's been painting for a very long time. And we built, so the instruments that are named after flowers are basically just based on the designs that he made. So those are all flowers from our neighborhood, with the exception of Purple Boy. I think that one was just like a sketch. Basically, that was an instrument. That was one of my earliest kalimbas that had withstood the test of time. And I was like, hey, I don't, and it was not my favorite one to play. It has since grown on me a bit, but I was like, hey, like, why don't you take this and try one of your designs on it? And he handed me this thing. I was dumbfounded. Like, you know, for a lot of my early instrument building, my practice was to slap a thing together, and as soon as it's making sound, I'd walk away. Like a lot of them did not look presentable. And so that series ended up being a collaboration with him. And so each of those are named basically literally from the flower and the design. Like left and right rows, we have a set, and I have them tuned kind of compatibly. And the daffodils and the bleeding heart are both. Bleeding heart is the name of a flower. He had some on his porch. So those I got more experimental with some of the kalimba stuff. You can see like loops of piano wire in there, and will those will stress out a subwoofer. It's really fun.
Oh, nice.
Um, yeah, and then some of the other stuff, like titles are really hard for me in general. I mean, I feel like I've gotten better at it, and sometimes I've written so many pieces the last few years. I've even gone down the route of snark, but the other ones like singing plates was meant to be very literal, because like that was basically I figured out you can tap a thread into a plate. Like I was working on this instrument called the glass organ, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but I figured out you could like thread a hole into a plate, and then you could also just cut threads into like polycarbonate rods. And so those rods just like screw in, and you like get your hand wet, and you rip the rod, and it like opens up the plate. Like it just makes it sing, frankly. And so that's like some of these sort of like, Rube Goldberg ish sketches are, they tend to get more literal titles. And then the glass organ was kind of a funny story. I originally called it a crystal Bachet to give credit to the Bachet brothers, who were the original ones who built those kinds of instruments. And then I found out that if you put the name Bachet on it, the Bachet estate might be a little litigious. So it got renamed the glass organ, because that instrument in particular, and for listeners at home, that instrument is basically a keyboard of glass rods. Each one is affixed to a metal rod, and the glass rods, you get your hands wet and you play it almost like a singing glass, like a wine glass, but it creates, it excites the metal rods and sort of acts more like a bow. So that like, which is what led me to build that instrument in the first place. When I found out that the glass did not have to be tuned, because I had no ambition to work with glass, but I also was having mad imposter syndrome about whether or not I was a quote unquote real instrument builder. So I decided to tackle an instrument like that, because there's maybe 5 people in the world that can build them. There's a few more now, which is great. Like there's a renewed interest in those instruments, which is awesome. I know that like there's a little documentary that pops up when you search for them. So like I hope that maybe I've encouraged some people, because I talk very plainly about building it and the struggles and also the successes of that. But yeah, that instrument, I settled on glass organ because it really feels like a little chapel organ. Like that's sort of how I approach it. It's like an instrument that I sort of had to accept. Like that one in particular, it's diatonic. It's the number of notes on it are based on like the materials I had when I started. It's very Ship of Theseus esque in the sense that like I replace as little as possible, but I have at this point replaced probably almost like 90% of the parts on it. Like and tuning it is a nightmare because you're dealing with a chaotic physical system that does not always respond linearly,
Right.
which is crazy. It'll break your brain. The first time you make a note that's shorter than the one next to it and it plays an octave lower, I lost it. I was just like, I'm in cuckoo land right now. I don't even know what I'm doing. Like, but that was like a big long period of research. Again, it was like maybe 2021 when I started that instrument. So still things weren't super open, and I was working very part-time, a lot of work from home, and just, went down the rabbit hole, emailed people from 3 different countries. They were all very helpful, like did a bunch of research, and now have a functional instrument that, I, at this point, I've had it enough years that I, come and go from it. Like I get tired of it and I come back to it, but I still learn to love it for what it is. Maybe someday I'll build like a big boy, but that one is,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, that's the one that I saw you play, and it was just like an absolutely, first of all, so much of your music and the sounds that your instruments make are just so stunningly gorgeous. I have to say
Oh,
that.
thank
And
you so much.
I'm not just saying that because, you're my friend and I'm talking
Yeah,
to
yeah.
you. Like it's just like as a composer myself, it's just like, wow, this is like it's immersive. And but I'm curious to know, like, when it comes to conceptualizing these instruments, when it comes to like the genesis of them, I mean, are you seeking something like very specific, or are you just kind of like, do you imagine a full instrument first? Do you imagine like a composition that requires something new like this? I mean, can you walk through the process
Yeah,
of?
yeah. So it's a combination of all of those things. So I think like like you play euphonium. Do you still play euphonium, or is like keyboard your main thing now?
No, I don't really play anything ever. But
Okay, well,
yeah.
when I'm sure you can relate that like when you do sit down with an instrument, you tend to like play a lick.
Yeah.
Your body emits, like, whether it's the same melody you played in junior high school, or your body does something. And improvisation has been like a really strong thread in my life. And so building instruments, a lot of times, especially with kalimbas and like retuning them and figuring out layouts, I'm pursuing something where it's like a mix between musical facility and sounds I want to hear, and then also how it feels to play. So like the physical interaction is what drives a lot of the glass organ, some of the kalimbas. And then there's things like the gravity harp, which frankly, the name gravity harp is very funny to me. I think it's elegant. I think it's a good name for that piece. The actual title for that instrument, which, to set a scene, it's a big 3x4 plywood board with a bunch of strings. I have tuning pegs. There's a bunch of strings that are kind of like haphazardly arranged along the length and in the height of it. And then there are these wooden balls that are hanging from strings that hit the strings. Like you pull a metal ball, you let it, or you pull a wooden ball, you let it go, and if the length of the string is right, it'll bounce off the metal strings and make like a repeating rhythm. And the title of that piece was Big Door Chime, because one time I was in like Cracker Barrel or something, and I saw one of those little hanging door chimes with like 4 wooden balls. And I was like, huh, that's kind of stupid. I think I should build like a really big one. Like, so it was the name of that for a long time was Big Door Chime. And it's cool. And then when I figured out I wasn't sure how much I was going to pursue that instrument until I figured out to put it on an axis, and so I could tilt it. That to me is like the most compelling thing about, like, that's like one of the most compelling gestures. That instrument, you build something kind of dumb. I mean, and when I say dumb, I don't mean that self disparagingly. Like, I think it's like, I think exploring simple things is like one of the greatest joys in life. So when I say it's like dumb, I mean like it's just like not, it's not an idea that you're gonna get by like sitting like the philosopher on the rock. Like it's like
Sure, yeah.
it's just an idea that I had in somebody's kitchen one time. So that in particular, being able to speed up, you have the rhythms are the speed of the hitting. I learned this from Tom Johnson. The speed of the rhythms are determined by the length of the pendulum. So you get these interesting cross rhythms. So like if you have proportions between the lengths of the strings, you get these like fours against fives, like really complex polyrhythms. And then by tilting it, you can speed those up. So that to me was a gesture where I was like, oh, that's cool. Where like without the needing a computer to like ramp up BPM or something, like I can do this like really sort of mind bending like a cello while creating these like polyrhythms that I really like. And it was also the first string instrument I made, so it was like nice to have a relationship to that.
I'm really glad that you brought up the gravity harp, because that's another instrument of yours that when I was like prepping for this conversation and watching the videos is just like unbelievably beautiful. And I think it's like a performance with a clarinet. Is that right? A
Oh
clarinet?
yeah.
Yeah.
That was the conclusion of that solo exhibition, Study in Place, and that was man, that was great. Eric Salazar is a clarinetist here in town. He also works as a composer, and he and I've been that's one of the like long standing collaborations in my life that's been very fruitful. And he pitched to me. He actually pitched it to me. He was like, or maybe I pitched it. I can't remember who pitched it to who, but I was like, hey, I want to do a big concert in this space. Like, do you want to be involved? You know, so it was basically a concert where I put chairs where they could, and I was very lucky. I convinced there was a videographer there that was supposed to just be documenting like for the gallery, like taking like
Yeah.
little shots for the
Yeah.
gallery, and he wanted to take a video of like part of the concert, and I was like, can I convince you to just stay? Like, it doesn't have to be a great video, but can I convince you to just stay for the whole concert? So I was really lucky that he was like very gracious enough to just record the whole concert. And so, yeah, that concert in particular was just like all of these. I was able to set up everything around it, and everything was connected via pickups. Like, and this sort of like low budget sci-fi where like I had back in this is a long time ago. My brother, there's a cable company in Richmond, Indiana, and my brother had traded this like pawn shop Telecaster for two industrial rolls of audio cable. And so they had been
Yeah.
sitting there for like 15 years. And I called him. I was like, hey, do you care if I take this? Because I have an idea. And he's like, yeah, go ahead. So I was able to I had enough cabling to build this like 8-channel surround system. I built the speakers for it. And all the instruments were like connected back into like a central brain. So I was processing it and throwing it around the room. And that is really, it's funny you mentioned that moment. You're an excellent interviewer. That's the moment where I was realized that I could start to bring some of these threads together in a serious way. That like in terms of like, instrument building as like a solo performance practice, chamber music. I mean, Lord knows I've asked percussionists to do really weird stuff, but the actual like, oh, I can bring my instruments in, I can write
Mm.
for them, I can figure this out. And that led to a couple of other pieces that I did with Sound Ecologies. I'm sort of doing like a concerto in slow motion where about once a year I'll write a movement. And Lord willing, as long as we continue, like I'll keep premiering a new movement. Well, this will be the final one this year, but I was able to write two pieces. One of them is called Where Is Your Reason Now? The title for that came from the fact that the orchestra concert is called Orchestra Mania and kind of has a vague wrestling theme. So I decided to try to title mine like what I thought a wrestler would say, like a wrestler like tagline. And then another one, Feather and Stone. So Where's Your Reason Now was the first time I got to play one of my instruments with an orchestra, and that was terrifying. First of all, because I was like, I think this is going to work. And then also, really, I mean, just, incredible when I realized it did work. Like when I
Yeah.
realized it
Oh
was
yeah.
working, I was just like, oh my gosh, like this is exactly what I want. And so then the second one, Feather and Stone, which is for gravity harp and orchestra, I kind of knew what I was doing. Like I had, I was like, okay, I'm going to make the orchestra kind of sound like this instrument. And, it was one of those things where, sometimes a piece, when you have so many irons in the fire, sometimes a piece will just emerge. And that piece for me just emerged where I was like, the gravity harp was sitting in my living room for a very long time, which was cool, but also frustrating because it's a big thing. And so, but I was used to hearing, like, I had these rhythms, like, because, like, I live like 30, maybe 25, 30 yards from the highway. So, like, sometimes when a big truck goes by, it'll kind of rattle everything in your house. These rhythms were like burned into my brain. And I was like, oh, at this point, I could probably just transcribe these without even touching the instrument. And I found like a subset of the strings that felt realistic to put together. Like if I worked with those rhythms in particular for the orchestra, it felt realistic to put together in a reasonable amount of rehearsals. So I stayed away from some of the rhythms that were really kind of gnarly. But yeah, that piece just came together very quickly and was really probably like the moment where I knew like the two practices were gonna have a life together for a long time.
You mentioned something earlier about like kind of coming and going to like a particular instrument. Like you'll spend some time with it, you'll play it a bunch, and then you'll kind of step away from it. I mean, how do you decide when an instrument is, I guess, finished, quote unquote, finished, like it's a complete entity, versus when it's like something that you do keep returning to and that you rethink it or even change it a little bit? How does that vary among what you do have?
Sometimes it's time. So like the glass organ is a very good example of like that instrument is great. Like I like it, but if I want it to do anything other than it does, like if I want it to be chromatic, for example, I will build a new one. I will fiddle with that one to make it playable, but it's done. Like it has to be done because I've rebuilt it too many times. So part of it can be fatigue. That doesn't always happen. That's actually the only one where I was really like, I have to make a line. Like the next one, like I just have to start from scratch if I build on this anymore. And then other times it's sort of like, there are sort of assumptions built into making instruments. Like a great example is the kalimba. So I was fascinated with kalimbas because I found a design online in high school that I immediately ripped off and still use variations of it to this day, where you can build a kalimba with what they call a grounding bar and spring steel tines. I used my parents' business to get a McMaster car account and ordered spring steel, and I think I still have some of that original spring steel left because they only sell it in like 60-foot rolls.
Yeah.
So, like for me, an instrument is done when I think I've worked through all of my assumptions or preconceived notions of what it should be. Like I think there's a moment of acceptance, and then obviously like part of that is like that acceptance comes from like a certain facility of expression. Like when I think that the facility of expression with an object matches up to what I think it should be or like what I think it can be. And kalimba is really interesting because kalimba in North America, if you get one on like Amazon or something, you can get really nice kalimbas for like $12. Like they're really, if you want one, just get one. They're nice. But I started thinking about key arrangement a lot, and I realized it's funny. I'd always been like I've always listened to a lot of like Shona Mbira music and was respectful of that part of it, which is where all of these plucked percussion instruments come from. But because I didn't have access to a teacher, I had never thought to buy one of those instruments because I was basically afraid of like owning a relic of another culture just to have it,
Yeah.
But one of the things that I realized I admit, like, so this is actually very recent, the instrument called Left Rose. I sat down and I was really unsatisfied with what I could play on it. And it was arranged like in the same key arrangement that all the Amazon ones will be that you get. And it's this layout that was introduced by Hugh Tracy, who was an ethnomusicologist in the 60s. He came to America and made a product called the Hugh Tracy kalimba. And the way those keys are laid out is like the lowest key is in the middle, and then the next one is on your left, and then on the right, and you alternate left to right all the way up. So I guess it must have been like April of last year. I really sat down and I was like frustrated. I loved the way the instrument sounded. I was frustrated with what I could do with it. And I sat down and I just wrote a key. I just was like, all right, let's throw out all assumptions. And I started thinking for some reason about Arvo Pärt. And I was like, what if I made a kalimba that could just do tintinnabulation? So just mellow like on the right, it's asymmetrical, but the notes that your right hand plays are a diatonic scale, and then on the left hand you just have an ascending triad. So you can do those like Arvo Pärt style, like imitation by like following it. I got really into Arvo Pärt in grad school and really like his like tintinnabulation is like his way of his like counterpoint language. Paul Hillier came up with that, but and now so now that I consider that instrument done, like it's like okay, I can spend years playing this, and so there's part of that, and then some instruments will surprise me. Like I have this one instrument that's like a seven. I'm looking at it right now. I'm trying to count 7 notes of a kalimba. And then it's on a really awkward sort of cubic box. It's not really like you can't really hold it in your hands. You kind of have to set it on a table. And then there's like 3 clock gongs, which you might be familiar with if you've listened to like the Lou Harrison percussion music. He uses
Right.
clock gongs on that one piece. So that instrument, I built it, kind of liked it. And then one day, actually this past summer, I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna sit down. I'm gonna alternate between like it was George Crumb again. We're back to George Crumb, but I was like, I haven't listened to Macrocosmos in a while, and I was just teaching 20th century music, so like all this music was back in my brain. I'd kind of not left it behind, but you move on, right? Like you listen to new things as you get older, and so like George Crumb was on my brain, and I was like, I'm just gonna like have this thing, have this box that like the clock gongs can make a lot of different sounds. I was like, let me just try this out. Like, let me, and so it was one of the best nights of my life last year, actually. Like, just sat down. I'd listen to a movement I was on my porch. It was nice and warm out. I'd listen to a movement of Macrocosmos. I'd stop, kind of take a moment, and then I would flip on the recorder and start improvising with this instrument. And what came out of that was, I don't know if I'll ever release it, but it was like a very, very surprising exercise in like very limited tonal material to a certain extent. You only have like 7 definite pitches, but then all the harmonics you can get out of the clock gongs and all this other stuff, and then all the timbres you can get from like hitting the box and doing all this stuff. And then, I pulled out my sort of library of like abused chopsticks and mini mallets. I've got like a whole great, like, like little guiro
Yeah.
sticks,
Right.
a couple smaller bows. And and I was just like, oh, well, I didn't think this instrument was really much of anything. And I was like, oh, this could do a lot. So, I mean, that's, yeah, something, there's some sort of like middle ground between like acceptance and like actualization that really tells me when something's done.
I'm just kind of curious because as I listen through your music, I mean, certainly you've touched on this plenty that you are no stranger to electronic music.
Mm-hmm.
But as I listen to these instruments, especially like the gravity harp and the glass organ, I mean, it like just kind of sounds like something that's electronic, even though it's fully acoustic. So, I mean, why choose to build an instrument and create that specific sound physically, I guess, over
Yeah.
just like crafting or synthesizing some sort of electronic sound that could sound the
Oh,
same?
yeah. I mean, I think it's partially performance practice. So, especially
Sure.
with
Yeah.
like improvisation, like it's kind of funny. Like, you can create like a really fantastic sound in a computer, right? Like, I love computer music. We could spend 2 hours on that, but you can't like slap the side of your laptop and make it do something new. So, like, there's something open, and people are getting very good at building physical, like, digital interfaces that have a high degree of flexibility. You can get metaphorical side slapping, but there is something very, I think it's the influence of those sounds on me as a listener and a composer, and then also just the immediacy and the freedom of having it be an object. Like the gravity harp, for example, like if I don't want to use those bouncing balls, I just throw them over the back and pluck the thing or, hit it with a mallet. And so it's sort of that sort of freedom, because I think a lot of my performance practice and really creative practice in general is based around like tinkering. And so that's one way to it's like it's hard to, especially when you want to get away from screens, when screens are so much of our lives. It's that I think is the main motivation, is that like a physical object has no like parameter. I mean, it does what it does, but it also can do whatever you do to it.
Yeah, totally. So usually by the time I get to this next question, guests have already kind of answered it indirectly, and I think you actually just answered a little bit of this. So let's just get right into it. What would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice? And I imagine tinkering must be one.
Yes. I mean, first I want to compliment you on the question, because I think it's a great question and it forced me to think a lot last night. And for me, the pillars for me are like tinkering is definitely one of them. For me, sometimes practice just looks like it doesn't look like practice. It looks like me just doing random stuff. So free play and improvisation is definitely one of probably the central pillar, like from me as a performer. And that comes from drum set. Like it comes straight from drum set, jazz, like all my early musical influences. Tinkering and building is a big thing. My dad is a bit of a tinkerer. He has, now he's retired. He's, customizing old trucks and stuff. And my grandfather, like I grew up with he had like a workshop that like he had built his own like surge protector and stuff. It was a fire hazard, but he had built his own like shelving systems and stuff. So I kind of came from a line of tinkerers, and that's really been central. And then the other one, which we haven't talked about as much, is one of the central things for me in my creative practice is translation. And what I mean by that is from the very beginning of my practice, especially on the technology side, and then I'll get to the physical side, a lot of it, like moving between formats. So, like moving, say, between, I think I mentioned it a bit, like a finale file and a MIDI file,
Sure.
and vice
Yeah.
versa, right? It used to not be so two-way. It used to be you could get it out, but not get it back in and have it look nice. But Dorico solves that a lot. I hope you find that feature useful. But the translation process is very interesting. In college, I got interested in poetry translation, which is a hugely messy business. It's great. It's like the best. It's like right at the central sort of core of like critical thinking, creative thinking, interpretation, all the things that we love about like great music performance. And so for me, translation, like moving from like, especially like software platforms that are wildly different, and sort of like moving between them, or I have this long-standing fear of the blank page. So I've developed a lot of activities around avoiding it, including writing. Some of my pieces start as music box melodies. You can get these music box kits from Amazon. I think I got mine from Amazon, and it's got these paper rolls, and you like punch the notes out.
Yeah.
And it's a slow process, but I find it impossible to be intimidated by a music box. Like that's like where maybe my ego saves me a little bit strategically. And then and B, when you take that music box roll, you write a thing that you kind of like, and then okay, I'm gonna turn this into chamber music. As you're entering this, right? Like I could just do it blindly, like, and I have done that before. Like sometimes I'll just start with a blind transcription. Like, okay, here's exactly what's on the music box roll. Here's what's on the page. I'll start there. Well, other times, I'll make mistakes, or as I'm translating it, I'll be like, I don't like how this sounds on piano. Like so through translation processes, I find new angles to look at musical ideas, and it also, I hope it keeps me from like calcifying my habits as tied to an interface. Like kind of like what I was talking about before, where when you sit down with an instrument and like play the same lick, it can get to. I've had periods where I sit down to write a piece and I write the same piece, like, or I start the same piece at least, and so that's a big one for me, is translation and like moving between all these different sort of creative outlets.
I love this like image of starting with a music box, because you're right. Not only like are there the possibilities of like, okay, I could like transcribe it literally, or I might make a mistake, and then that invites some like possibility I never thought of. But also like you're pretty much like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I've never actually played with a music box, but um I mean, it's like a sequence of notes, and then you're kind of just moving at your own pace to get through the sequence. So like you could really refine like the pacing of a line that way. I mean, that's like a really fascinating idea to me.
Yeah, no, it's great. And that's another, you were talking about what draws me to do some of the physical stuff. That's, that's a thing. It's like, gosh, I mean, I feel like I'm right at that right age to understand a little
Mm.
bit of just how good we have it in terms of music technology.
Yeah, yeah,
Stuff that I used to that used to take an afternoon takes 30 seconds now, and I'm so grateful for that. But then there are times when I don't feel like automating, like messing with like automating tempo to see how I want a line to stretch, or like, and I can just do it. Like it's like there's
yeah.
something about the immediacy of just doing it that really attracts me.
If you'd like to support this work directly, Patreon is the sole source of income for Loose Leaf Transmissions. It's what makes the time, equipment, and ability to say yes to more conversations and better programming possible. And if you're not ready for ongoing support, you can also leave a one-time tip on coffee. You'll find both options at looseleaftransmissions.com/support. And thanks so much for supporting this work. Well, this conversation about like how you work and how you create the music now, like getting away from instrument building and more into actual composition, I mean, is the perfect segue to my next question, which is, in our pre-interview correspondence, you said something that really stood out to me, which was that composition for you often starts with the delete key.
Oh yeah.
And as I like over the past 5 years, as I get deeper into some of the more philosophies of my own music, I keep landing on the word restraint. Like my music requires restraint, and so like I don't know if that's exactly what you mean, but that's what came to mind. So I guess with that frame or with a different frame, whatever you choose, what are you deleting away from when you mean delete key? And what are you trying to make space for by working in that way, by like this, I don't know, process of elimination, maybe?
Yeah, so my composition process, I think when I'm sitting down to, the process changes a lot, but like a typical way I'll start is I'll have a pile of ideas. And sometimes I'll just throw all those piles in a document. Like I'll just pretend that that's the piece. So I have this, and I do use. I know that we're supposed to use our imaginations, but at certain parts of the process, I definitely use computer playback to assist this. But I will listen to an idea, and I'll just start kind of tinkering. I mean, honestly, tinkering with it, and then I'll usually when I get to like a first draft, there's something in there that I really like, and I won't be able to point at what yet. So I sort of just have a pile. I'll start with like a pile of musical material, and then once I get to that point where I'm like, I like this, and when I'm changing it, I'm not liking it, but I don't know exactly what the exact thing is that's bothering me. Sometimes it's like, and usually it's like a combination of a few things, but I'll take a break, and that can be 20 minutes or 2 days or whatever, it can be just, and then when I come back to it, usually what'll start to happen is I'll have like in my brain, I'll remember the things that I actually liked,
Yeah.
or the thing I'm pursuing. And so then when I really start to get into it, all the things that I don't act like subconsciously am not attracted to start sticking out like sore thumbs.
Mm.
So then when I can start to like cut away, that's when I really start to get an idea of like what a piece is going to be. The music boxes are a way of generating material. Like I love, generating material, recording things, like doing all this stuff, and then sort of figuring out, like letting my intuition guide, sort of making a mess, and then sort of pulling out the thing that I think is going to, is the thing that interests me about the pile, and then shaping that into something that I want to listen to.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I wrote a big piano piece last year that I've talked about plenty on the podcast, Tattoo, which I will rehash. But a big part of finishing that piece was just like eliminating broad sections of music that I had
Oh
written,
yeah.
and it's like music that I really loved. I mean, what's the like Kill Your Darlings, right? Like,
Oh
I mean,
yeah.
it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
you do have to do that sometimes, and I don't know. I've become so mindful of that part of the process now, where it feels like I I don't want to waste time. I don't want to like overproduce. I don't want to overgenerate material and get lost in that. But certain things do emerge through working in that process that I don't think would emerge otherwise. Like it's like
Yeah.
I can't just I'm starting a new piece now, and I don't know what's going to happen in the middle of this movement that I'm trying to write. I know how I want it to begin. I know how I want it to end. And I just know that like in order to crack the code of the middle of that, I have to just write. and then and then probably get rid of a bunch of stuff to, just see what kind of happens. Right. And so I feel like that's really essential, I think.
And I can't remember what I used to do with Finale, but I had a habit with Sibelius for a long time where they have this like ideas section. And it's sort of file agnostic. It's like one of the few things about Sibelius that I truly loved, where it's like you could highlight a section, cut it and like paste it into like the ideas folder. I'll be very honest, everything that went into that ideas folder never came back out. It was always me being like, okay, I'm gonna get rid of this, but it's not gone forever. Like it was literally like, but it really was like I was dropping my children off at like the gas station. Like I'll come back for you. Um,
Yeah.
and so yeah, and now like that has sort of morphed actually. Like not to get too in the weeds on notation software, but I do know a lot of us are feeling the Dorico stress. I'm not. I switched pretty early, specifically because Sibelius had switched to like a subscription model, and it
Right.
made me
Yeah.
so mad that
Yep.
Andorico came out. It was like, hey, we'll just sell it to you. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
That's literally it. Like, there's no like, I'm not like and I believe everybody should just use what works for them. But Dorico has a feature with one key where you can split things into different movements and work on them independently, and that made it even easier because then you're like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna put you over here and I'll come back to you, and then I can bring you back in. Most of the time those go to the way of the dodo as well. They are those extra movements. It's like, oh, this piece is 3 movements, there's 47 movements in the file. Okay, it's time to let go of these.
But it's like the psychology of that is so funny.
Oh yeah.
It's kind of like we're being precious with this material, and it's like, oh, I really like this, and yeah, and then it's like there's a reason that we can't figure out. Like it just doesn't belong
Right.
where we want it, and yeah.
Yeah, and I'm thoroughly a proponent of tricking yourself to get to where you need to go. So like, yeah,
Yes.
that's like, it's not goodbye forever. When you're talking about the stuff that ends up on the cutting room floor, it's like, it's okay if it is, like life comes at you. You don't like, one of the things that one of my composition teachers, Jamie Aikman, told me that stuck with me was like, he was like, you'll always have way more ideas than you'll have time to write pieces. So don't worry about it. Write down the idea and keep working on the thing you're working on. Like don't get bogged down. And that also is sort of inverse where it's like, oftentimes you're generating ideas that are related to where you are as a person. And I do like writing down ideas for pieces that sometimes never make the light of day, or I go back and review things. Like if I'm not sure what my next like sort of petri dish project is going to be, like a piece that I'll work on for a long time in little bursts that like may never see the light of day, like that. Those can be helpful. It's like, oh yeah, that was a good idea, and I was in the middle of writing this huge piece, so I didn't get to it. But yeah, it is funny. It's like we're just human. We're when you spend all this time creating a thing, like you get attached to it.
So one of the other things that you said to me before we met is that you're actively trying to find a voice that comes from a place of peace rather than endless grind, which I just absolutely feel you on that. But it's also like that's like one of those things. It's a lot easier to say that than it is to live. So what have you had to either learn or unlearn, maybe structurally or psychologically, to move toward that, in your compositional voice, I mean, I feel like when I listen to your music, there is a lot of, I hesitate to describe it as ambient, but it's like a really, it's like just really lovely stuff. And, I'm not sure if that's what you mean by place of peace or if it's something a little
Oh,
different.
yeah, that's very kind. I think there's it's sort of there's a lot of this is a very good problem to have, but like I recently, I guess in November of last year, I released a record that was sort of the document of like the 2 years leading up to that, and it's 90 minutes of stuff. Like it's like a whole solo record, and then also a record of chamber music, and there's a couple orchestral pieces on there. And in the time it took me to like produce that record, I had like another hour of chamber music written, like and performed and recorded and ready to go. Like I could put out another record today. And that was because of two things. In 2024, I was still working for Percussive Art Society full time, but because the museum, the Rhythm Discovery Center, which I talked about a little bit earlier, had flooded and closed, my job had switched to an office job. I want to make it very clear that I love all the people that work there, but I am not an office guy. I'm like I need to be on my feet. I need to be doing things. And, I was very lucky that I kept a job there, but I was starting to become one of those people like that my personality was like complaining about work after about a year in the office. So 2024, I took literally every freelance. I was probably working between like 60 and 70 hours a week between work and like music related stuff. I took every commission I possibly could. I took projects like I actually this is coming out this year. I helped design like a musical hot dog cart. I took a lot of different stuff, and I was doing sound for everything I could. And I was producing. I was writing a lot of music. I think I wrote like 10 pieces that year, and then this past year. So basically, in August of 2024, I got offered to some teaching at Indiana University, Indianapolis, and I had basically been taking all this work to like save up to quit my job because I had hit that point where, I'm not married, but I had definitely hit that point where if I had been married, my partner would have been like, quit your job. Like, I don't care what
Right.
happens, just quit your job. You're miserable. And so
Right.
but I needed to build my own exit plan. So that was it. And so there were a few of those pieces like where I would get done with them. I'd be happy with the piece, but then I would be like, man, I wish I had like 3 more days working on that piece with nothing going on. Like I wish it wasn't like, I wish it didn't feel like part of that writing experience was with like a giant ticking clock over my head, and a deadline on the horizon. So for me, what that means is, I just finished my first full calendar year as a freelancer. So I'm teaching adjunct, I'm doing a bunch of different things to make ends meet. Thankfully, mostly like art and sound related. And I got through the year. I took a break in December, and then this year, like the whole like I guess what I'm getting at is like this year it's kind of funny, it's boring, but it's like task management. And it's like being like so I've started doing this thing. I used to do it and then fell off, got distracted, and but this year I've been pretty religious about like every day I will copy out all of my projects, make changes to like things that have changed, like write down tasks that need to be done. And it's a massive to-do list. Like it's like 2 full pages. But handwriting it and updating it, and like at least just looking at things, it also goes back to like prioritizing composition time. If like 3 days go by and I'm sitting on the same, like all the pieces are like either hypothetical or in the same status, I'm like, oh, okay, like today it doesn't matter. Like, send your emails, do the things that are quick, but then turn everything off and get out of here for 4 hours because that's what you actually need to do. That is where I'm coming from, I think, is like trying to maintain a level of mindfulness and sort of joy from all these opportunities rather than let it become this sort of chaotic, run from thing A to thing B to thing C to thing D, which can happen. And part of it is just because, I feel like a lot of the experiences of my childhood from, being allowed to join gamelan, like all these musical experiences I had early on, it was instilled in me that there were all these key moments that were based on other people being generous with their time. And I think that that is if somebody I would, if somebody were to describe me, I hope that that would be the one thing that I would want. Somebody is like being generous with time and knowledge and, resources. But to do that, to be that way, you have to be organized, right? Like to
Yeah,
be
right, right.
open, and I've also, it's just like we learn things as we get older. I've also, it's just like there's also times where if I'm like that, with if instead of composing, I walk down the street and I'm like, hey, what do you need help with today? Like that's sort of self-destructive in a weird way, even though it's a good thing to do, and a nice, kind thing to do. It's like sometimes, so it's like it's a balancing act. It's like making sure that I do treat myself as a priority, even though I really value that. Just like being, I don't know, being around and being part of something kind of bigger than myself in a lot of ways.
Oh man, you're like giving me flashbacks to like me in 20 late 2016, 2017. I was
Mm-hmm.
like kind of just starting to be full-time at my radio job, but
Oh
also
yeah.
I like wrote the most music I've ever written in a year, like in 2017. And also Suzanne and I, we were running like this event series in Tampa called Toronto Music, which was basically like concerts where we paired contemporary music with local beverage, local food, that kind of stuff. We popped up at like bars and stuff, and it's very rewarding. But like, I, I'm like, I think I'd like to think that I come off as like a pretty chill guy. I was
Yeah.
in inside, I was so like mental breakdown, panic attack that
Oh
year,
yeah.
just for
Yeah.
and I guess my point is like I'm like looking at the horizon and I'm entering what I hope to be a very fruitful creative period, and I'm like I have that in the back of my head and it's like, oh my god, don't get yourself into that again. And I think that you're right, the key is staying hyper organized, and it's like, man, I'm so glad that I have like 8, 9, 10 years of experience now, because I think I have the tools to avoid that kind of like I hesitate to call it like a rat race, but it's kind of like it's a grind. It's the endless grind of like you can't you can't get let yourself celebrate because you got to move on to the next thing. And I mean, like we were also very not organized with these concerts we were doing. I mean, we were just like picking dates and kind of like throwing it together as we went, and they were I mean they were well received and, like I said, rewarding, but it was just kind of like, okay, if we're going to do this again, we have to like plan out a whole season because we just about killed each other. It's like we were both like so stressed. So anyway, big advocate for being organized. Yes.
Yeah, and yeah, and I use the notebook because at this point I have 4 email addresses with all the stuff going on, and it's like, and the thought of integrating them, I know that somebody's gonna be like, well, they can all go to the same inbox. You're crazy. That would make me sick. So being able to step outside of it and like have like sort of a dashboard that's also like pen and paper. Again, I guess it's like that theme of like physical immediacy where it's like I don't have to have a widget to add extra notes to a thing. It doesn't have to fit into the box of a calendar event, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Even though I use those tools, I'd rather, I guess in some ways, I'm a little resistant to like diving into more platforms for productivity integration unless they really solve like, I still have this maybe antiquated notion at this point. I mean, hopefully it's not antiquated. I think people are kind of pushing back on like all the AI integration, but like, you know, I like a wrench to be a wrench. I don't need my wrench to be a calendar. Like it's it's yeah, keeping a tool um is pretty important to me.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the other questions that I ask everybody is, related to inspiration. You've touched on plenty of inspiration so far, but again, I'll ask you more directly. What is a piece of music or a song or even like a film, a book, piece of art, any kind of artistic artifact that changed the way that you thought about your creative practice, or even like changed your life in a lot of ways?
Yeah, I'd say musically the one for me, and this is goes back to some of the time in high school. So even though I didn't have a composition teacher or anything, I was seeking out some of this stuff. And was out in Outlet Mall somewhere in southern Indiana with my mom, sort of being drug around. And I found this book called American Mavericks. And it's like 5 or 6 sections. Cannot remember who wrote it. It was published by that art book publisher Phaidon. Beautiful book. And it was like started with Charles Ives, Edgar Varese, John Cage, and Henry Cowell. And so I got that book and my world got cracked open again. Like learning about those guys, I was like, oh, these are like my dudes. Like
Right.
yeah, like this is what it was very life affirming where I was like, because I feel like I was just kind of this weird dude doing a thing, it was a lot of that practice was solitary. Like for a long time, like composing and even performing outside of sort of larger ensembles was a very like solo kind of isolating practice. And so having that text really made me feel like, okay, there are other people like this. Like I'm not completely off my rocker. Like there's a place in the universe for this. Like and that book, and then all the music that it led me to. Like it was just, any hope that anyone had that I would like, go back and like Mahler was dashed on the rocks of that book. Although I do like, it's funny, I do a lot of experimental stuff, but I do listen to a wide variety of stuff. But yeah, that book is what stuck out to me is that.
Yeah, I knew about John Cage in undergrad, but it was like grad school when I discovered Varese, and I was like, oh man, like this is like life-changing stuff.
He's cool. Yeah.
So I wanted to be sure that I touched on the role of community in your work, which you have also touched on throughout this conversation. And not community as like not just a value, but as something that you actively build through like your work with Sound Ecologies, the residency you're doing, installations and teaching and collaboration. So can you talk a little bit about what community means to you in this moment in time in January 2026?
Yeah. Community, it does mean groups of people. So like Sound Ecologies is an environment that's very supportive. And we do have one rule to be involved with Sound Ecologies. Although I talked to you about being involved, you might be accepted from this rule because you live in Cincinnati. We might have you on later, but the one rule we tell anybody who has like heard about us and is like interested in working with us, all we say is just come to one concert before you write. Just come to one concert that's not about you. And it's such a simple rule. Like it's very rare that like you say that out loud, but like usually the form is like when somebody's like really interested, rather than like have the conversation of like, oh yeah, we have these opportunities, just be like, hey, here's the next concert. You should come hang out. Because the group is so welcoming and creating a culture where people consistently show up when it's not about them, creates this whole culture. And so musically, like on that side, so Sound Ecologies is a very ambitious. We've done 2 seasons of like 10 concerts each. I think we're paring it down this year.
Yeah.
We were doing like a concert a month and all new works. I mean, some of our, our baseball card stats are kind of insane. We've premiered over 150 new works in like 3 years. It's awesome. I mean, it's great. And, I remember one of the concerts was really funny where it was a string quartet concert and I think I had like skipped the concert before but we were all like 4 of us that had been hanging out the most, and had been in it the longest, all wrote pieces for this one. And we all wrote through composed pieces. We didn't talk about it at all. And it was like, all of a sudden, it was like, is there an Indianapolis style now? What happened? And it wasn't like, and it's so like, it's non-hierarchical, like I think people lend their expertise when they have it, but it's like that moment to me, it was really special. So I guess to sum that up, like making composition, which for a long time in my life felt very like solitary, turning that into a communal like activity has been really transformative. Giving people opportunities. So like we've premiered things, but like they'll be their like college students' first orchestra piece or like stuff like that. Right. We're giving some people some really, I'm like just love opening doors for people, because I feel like I'm standing at the series of a bunch of doors that were open for me. I'm standing at the end of that. And then the other thing about community too is just, I don't want to, certainly don't want to go into the politics of the moment, because it's depressing. But regardless of electoral politics, technology in general, I'd say even like streaming services, like do this. They encourage sort of this sort of like social individualism that I think, and like that is slowly eroding. You could like I didn't know the term third space until like a year and a half ago, but that kind of clicked for me, where everything's being so driven by cash economics that like people aren't just like hanging out anymore. So that's another thing that, and that's what, like, with the Contemporary Art Museum in Indianapolis, like that name is fairly recent change. Used to be a used to be called Big Car, as from a poem. I can remember the couplet but not the whole poem, but the line is, sometimes I want to just get in a big car and drive away. Whoa, buddy, slow down. And so it's that whole mission of that organization is about making art in Indianapolis and like bringing people in, and it's a very welcoming space, and they create a lot of opportunities, and I've certainly benefited from that, but it's also been a learning experience. And so I think that's a big part of it too, which is like community is just creating space where people can come together without uh, without needing to feel like they need to produce any, that they need to do anything other than just show up, and enjoy things. Yeah, those are the two big ones, community for me. And then I do a lot of what they call community outreach too. So like I have a program that I started with the city parks here in Indianapolis, where I go and do drum circles for all their summer camps. I love that program. I'm sick to death of drum circles. I think I've done well over 1,000 in my life with my old job. But those are places that don't often have a budget. I'm able to provide that for free, and like the kids love it. Just like going out and making music with kids is like one of the best things you can do. It's like the most fun. And when they're given permission to get loud, they like it, especially like younger kids. Sure. It's like, oh yeah, go nuts. Like that's what we're here for.
Yeah. Well, I of course totally agree with everything you're saying, but what it brings to mind for me is it's like this just kind of phrase that's been rattling around in my head lately. And I think about it in terms of like actual music that I'm composing, but also I think it speaks to what you're describing through your community work. And I think my community work too, through like this podcast and the radio show that I do. And, whatever, whoever you are listening, whatever you do in addition to like your art making or community making or whatever. And it's like I'm starting to increasingly feel like my job is to just like create the conditions for people to have like a nice place to be for a little bit. Like if my piece is like 10 minutes long, I just want, I want to achieve things in that piece. I want to express what I want to express artistically. And, sometimes that gets deep philosophically and sometimes not, and like whatever. But at the end of the day, it's like my goal, I just want it to be a nice 10 minutes for people to kind of sit in for a little bit, and I feel like what you're talking about, like, show up to this event without pretense of producing anything. It's like, just come and like have a nice time. and it's like, that's like so important now. And it's easy to forget. I think when we institutionalize things, it's really easy to forget that, like, at the end of the day, that's like, I don't know if it's our jobs as creators, but it's like certainly like when we're thinking about like the public facing nature of what we do, it's like, yeah, that's all we're really doing is making a nice place for someone to be for a little bit.
Right. It's a really nice thing. And it's definitely a nice shift from the sort of like, sort of trepidatious, like, what does this piece mean for me as, a composer, or like, what does this piece mean about my identity? When you sort of get through that myth and realize that, like, a function of music can be to just create something nice, like it's, it sounds so simple, but it is like, it's what it's there for.
Yeah. It's something I'm like, I'm still like trying to see like, can I check all my personal boxes that I want to achieve and still do that? And I think the answer is yes. So I don't know. Stay tuned, I guess. um, so with this in mind, with like with community and also the collaborations you do, I'm wondering because you said that you're most drawn to collaborations that push you out of your comfort zone, even ones with unrealistic timelines. Which what's that? I always forget that Leonard Bernstein quote about like not enough time. Like you need a plan and not enough time. And it's like that's how great
Yeah.
art is made. So I'm not sure if
Yeah.
that's what you mean, but at any rate, I mean, what do these kinds of constraints unlock for you that like ideal conditions don't? Because I do think there is something to like, okay, I don't have enough time, or like I need to squeeze this in here, or I've never done anything like this before. I need to think outside the box. That really, I do think forces us all to kind of confront some things that we otherwise wouldn't.
For me, I mean, I think part of it is like, with projects that have a long sort of pre-planning, planning phase, and a lot of like sort of pre-management too. That's like really the one that drags me down. I don't mind having conversations, but the ones that have these like long sort of development processes, especially when there's like a clear goal. Like I think at this point, like if I've accepted a project, I'm like confident enough in a lot of my intuition and a lot of my feelings about, and also just logistical experience. I have a lot of experience like managing stuff, and more often than not, the projects that have been successful are the ones that like clearly identify a goal, have a decent idea of like the fundamentals, of like what it needs to be. I'm trying to think of like a good example, like even something as simple as like if you're trying to like figure out the right sound system for a venue, you can either spend months and months and months researching every single component, or you could spend months researching one, get like the mixer for example, and then build everything around it. Like I really like this metaphor of like setting sail and then building the ship at sea, like which is absurd, but it really like I think that because partially because of the way I think, and that like sort of improvisation and sort of like quick creative problem solving is really where I feel like I'm comfortable, or that I excel. Like I think you know, getting out of things where it's like, oh cool, we got 6 months to plan this. It's like, no, we have to do this in 2 months and we all are busy, and like it's like, okay, so here's what needs to happen. And then we do that, and then, usually like I think like people, and I am no exception to this. I think a lot of times I've been fearful of like a critical error being introduced, but generally that's just not how stuff goes.
No.
Like if something is half built and you realize it's wrong, you fix it.
Yeah.
Rather,
Right.
but oftentimes like building a thing twice is faster than trying to think of the perfect thing. Like I mean, I guess it's akin to, they do those. I think there's like they've done experiments where they're like they have people who are like they give some people like they have a ceramics class and they give half of them, they're like, you can make the perfect cup, and then they're like they give the other people, they're like they give a bunch of other people a ton of clay and they're like, make as many cups as you can. Eventually the people like really what ends up happening is the people that make a bunch of cups end up making their end product ends up like their nicest cup is better than the perfect cup from the
Right.
other group.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I think, yeah, getting out of that headspace. And I think, I mean, yeah, it's certainly a through line for a lot of composers, just the like the self, the anxiety or the second guessing oneself, because, and that relates to what I was talking about with music starts with the delete key. Like once you're in a situation, generally you'll react correctly. Like, and so create a situation where you're starting to think, like where you're starting to react. Like blue sky thinking is like to me a very limited, well, unless, I mean, obviously some projects can be very complicated, but like, like this building that I'm helping open here next door is like a 70,000 square foot building with 18 studios, 4 galleries, a performance venue, a kitchen, and all of that. It's like, no, we're not building that ship at sea. We got to plan a lot of stuff.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
then it's a lot of management too. It's like when they start building stuff, you got to check on it and stuff. But yeah, like that's sort of what I mean is just getting to a place where you're thinking creatively, and that for me at least is not always in the planning process. It's in the execution.
Totally. And I don't remember the exact, like, I don't think it's a quote. It's like something I heard someone say once about composing, which is like, you're pretty much coming up with like defying listener expectations and surprising people, and that's like what makes a quote unquote good piece of music. I mean, I don't know if I totally agree with that, but I found that
Yeah.
the music that like hits me the hardest, or like I have the most emotional or visceral reaction to, does follow that rule. And I feel like my most successful pieces also follow that rule. And you're right, it's like I kind of have to create a situation where I surprise myself if I'm doing that in my own music, and it's like I can't plan for that.
No, you just have to do it. And I think I'm with you on that. I do think that some of my favorite things I've written involve those kinds of moments where it's like, whoa, what the hell just happened?
Yeah, it's, oh, that's cool. Okay, let's run with it now.
Yeah, exactly.
So getting into my final set of questions here, these are questions that I ask everyone, and it's always fun to see, like, kind of like end on a lighthearted note, I think, for the most part. To kick things off, what do you think you would be doing artistically or otherwise if it wasn't composing? And because you mentioned earlier that you studied philosophy, I'll kind of take that out of the equation as well.
Okay.
So make it hard for you.
Yeah, I think I would either be a writer or a teacher. I think those are the two things. Teacher, maybe not so much. If I really think about the reality of being in the same space every day, but I do love teaching, and writing shares that same thing with composition, where you're sort of distilling the world around you and sort of seeing an angle in an otherwise maybe chaotic world. And so those are the two things that came to mind. If not, I'd be in like some sort of the other one I thought of was maybe a very idiosyncratic repair practice, like fixing like very specific things, like antique clocks or something.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
What are you trying to get better at in your creative practice right now?
We touched on this a little bit earlier. Task management and like really prioritizing, managing time. That's really what I'm to the point now, and I realized this, a few months ago. It's like, well, right now, I mean, like everything's going well, and I have the ingredients for the life I've always wanted, and part of it is just organizing it in such a way, not to go back to piles again, but it's like it's like at this point, it's like piles of opportunities and obligations, and sort of configuring that into a way that brings more peace and joy than stress, then that's it for me right now. It's just like getting all of that sort of afloat, and then building on that, and using that organization to build like consistency for myself. So it's like,
yeah,
I don't work myself to the bone and then collapse. Like I have reasonable days, and I'm okay with that. Like kind of get the monkey of constant productivity off my back a little bit.
I feel that. And as I hinted at, I've stepped into this new kind of modality of living myself that's more freelance, more in pursuit of the projects that I want to like fully want to be doing myself, that's like fully self-generated. And it's a little scary in part because it does require a ton of organization, but I also like get worried sometimes when I like maybe have an off day, and like I find that I can't quite focus and like actually stick to my guns with the things that I've been organizing. And
Yeah.
I saw like I think it was a meme. It's like kind of meta, I guess, but I saw a meme on my phone a month or two ago that was like, phones are just cigarettes for your eyes. And in the past like 2 or 3 weeks, as I'm like acclimating to my new schedule, I'm like paying attention. Okay, if I wake up and I sit in bed and I like scroll through my phone for like an hour before getting out of bed, even if I wake up early and I do that, just like throws off my entire day.
Totally.
Whereas if I'm like very concerted, like, okay, I'll lay here for 30 minutes and stare at the ceiling and kind of collect my thoughts, but I'm not gonna like get into the phone. I'm not gonna scroll through social media, Reddit, or the news or whatever. And those days are so much better. I had a day like that yesterday, and I had a like the unfocused, like I scrolled too much this morning day today. It's like funny to I'm glad I'm cognizant of it, but it's like
No,
for real.
it's
It's like,
and that's really the first step. I took a big social media break last year for a couple months, and then I went back on because I had like a string of concerts, and I was like, it's easier to do this from my phone than on the desktop, and then I got sucked right back in. So again, like mid December, I just deleted all my social media apps, and I'm just like, okay, I can check Instagram on my computer, and for some reason, being at the laptop, I don't even touch reels. I don't touch any of the addictive stuff. I don't know what it
exactly.
is. So it's great. Like, and now, especially now that you can, like, there was a long time where you couldn't like post to Instagram from your laptop. Now you can. So there's like really, I can get all the benefits, like, like anything I want to see is probably just in my feed. My friends are in my normal feed, and just don't even click the garbage.
Yeah, for sure. I guess on that note, maybe is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from? And this could be like an actual object. It could be a software, a process. It could be something just for musicians. It could be something for anybody and everybody listening. I mean, whatever that tool is for you that you want to get people on.
There's sort of three, I guess there's like three things I would mention. One is, I think diversifying musical outlets is a huge one. Like, just find a way to interface with music that is not, especially as a composer, that is not tied to like your, whatever story you're building about yourself. Like, figure out, and for me, I play in a Balinese gamelan group. It's hard music. It's fun, and it's like there's no notation, which is great. So it completely removes any sort of like Western or any sort of like anxiety inducing totem from like concert music is
Right,
gone.
right.
And I'm there, and it's a very communal music. Like, you're often interlocking with the people next to you, so it forces you to listen well, and it's also like I am in no way in charge. It's great. Like, it's like I am there to show up and learn. And then I think improvisation is another one that I think, like, and it gets talked about a lot in classical circles, but like just learning to improvise, whatever that means for you. Like, it can be, you can just make cat noises, you can do whatever you want, but just developing that freedom for yourself, I think, is really something that I hope like everybody gets to experience as part of their musical life, just because it's like it's fun, and it's like, and it's interesting, and it's, and you can build a voice, and eventually like you can have extemporaneous musical conversations with other people, which is unlike any other experience in the world. Like meeting someone for the first time and sitting and like really like within an hour you're playing a show with them, and then something actually happens. Like, it's really, it's a really special thing. And then, I would suggest everybody get a music box or some other way to sort of jump the blank page. I just think the blank page is terrifying. Maybe not terrifying anymore, but more like I still hate it.
Yeah.
And like,
Anxiety inducing, at least.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I really think like building up like a vocabulary of tricks, and for me, it's the music box, and the music box is fun, and it's inexpensive, and you just kind of make a little tune for yourself, and I think, yeah, that's one that I would, stuff like that would be a good one for everybody, I think.
Yeah, I want to try that one. I need to find a music box. So my final question, this is often like the most difficult question, but hopefully not. And that is, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
Mm. Oh gosh, it's always hard to talk about yourself. You did save the hardest one for last.
In fairness, you've talked about yourself for about 2.5 hours.
That's
So
that's true. But this is, I think maybe this is more existential than some of the answers, but like, I think the thing that I would say is like, it's easy to forget how, just miraculous all of this is. Like, music is just like one of the best things we do as people and one of the most beautiful experiences, imaginable in a lot of ways. And I think that, like, if I could say that's like sort of the thesis of a lot of what I do with the instrument building and stuff is like I want people to like the point of a lot of my work, especially with like the pieces that use weird instruments and stuff, is to not weird them out, but inspire like a sense of wonder. I really like creating things that are simple and are simple. Like you look at it, you kind of get an idea of how it works, and then it works that way. But if it's something you haven't seen, it's an easy way to like invite people in to like think about things a little differently or really like hopefully rediscover, a little bit of wonder or a little bit of like appreciation for just like the number of, the freedom we all have of expression. Yeah, I think that's like maybe the central thesis is that I'm always, I want to surprise people with simple things.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's in a world where we're like constantly inundated with BS all the time. I think
Yeah.
that's like such a like a balm. not to wax poetic too much, but it's just like so. I think more of us need to be making music like that. I think
And it's hard to be simple,
it is
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah, and that's definitely something I've learned over the last couple of years writing these pieces with, few rehearsals. It's like cut away the you know what I mean? Like anything that can be done in a simpler way, just do it. Like don't worry about it.
Well, Rob, if this conversation has taught me anything, it's that we need to hang out more often.
Yeah,
We're close enough to
totally.
do it. So
Yeah,
hopefully
yeah.
we'll get a chance to talk shop again soon. But this has been awesome learning about you. And I mean, folks, check out the build page. I mean, it's just really awesome stuff. So anyway, at any rate, thanks so much for joining me, Rob. And
Yeah.
it's been great.
Thank you. This was awesome.
I just loved hanging out with Rob for this week's episode. Many thanks to him. And I really loved what he said near the end, that the whole point of his work, from the instruments to the installations, the community building, all of it, is to surprise people with simple things. And that is something that I keep thinking about as well in my own work. You can learn more about Rob Funkhouser and his work, including his instruments build page, which is genuinely worth your time, on his website, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. I'm Tyler Kline. Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. The show is produced by Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears, and you can explore more episodes of the podcast, more episodes of our radio show Living Classical, and find ways to support all of the work on our website. That's looseleaftransmissions.com. Thanks again for listening. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you back here again next time. If this has been your first time listening to Music Maker, well, good news, there are over 40 episodes in the archive. I've also got a companion show called Micromaker with short excerpts from these interviews, with new episodes releasing multiple times each week. And if you want to make sure that you don't miss anything, follow both shows on whatever app that you're using. Thanks again for listening.